A face is the first thing we look for, and the last thing the body loses in memory. But bone does not keep a face. Time takes the skin, the eyes, the small human signs that once made someone recognizable. Nearly 9,500 years ago, ancient hands seem to have resisted that loss. They took a human skull, shaped plaster over it, placed shells where eyes had been, and brought something like a face back into the room. Not fully alive, not fully gone. A 9,500-year-old skull was given a face again. Why did ancient humans do this? A human face can change a room before a word is spoken. Even now, in a world filled with screens, mirrors, photographs and names, we still search for a face first. We look for the eyes before we understand the voice. When someone we love is absent, the mind does not begin by remembering their bones, or their height, or the weight of their body. It reaches for the small shape of the face, the angle of the brow, the way the cheeks held light, the expression that made one person different from every other person on earth. This feels ordinary because it happens quietly, almost beneath thought. Yet it is one of the deepest things about being human. Our species learned to live by reading one another at close range. A face could mean safety, kinship, warning, grief, hunger, comfort, recognition. Before writing, before cities, before anyone could leave a name carved into stone, the face was already a kind of memory carried inside other minds. It was how a person remained present when they turned away, and how they could return in thought after they were gone. This is why the loss of a face is not only the loss of appearance, it is the loss of a doorway. The body after death changes in ways the living cannot stop. Skin loosens and disappears. Eyes, which once held attention and response, no longer remain as eyes. The lips that shaped speech become silent matter. The gestures that made someone known vanish faster than bone. What stays longest is not the living person, but the hard structure underneath, the skull, the quiet frame that once carried all those moving signs. For most of human existence, long before settled villages rose in the Levant, long before people built houses with floors that could hold generations of footprints, this fading would have been part of life. Small bands of humans and earlier human relatives moved through landscapes where death could not be hidden for long. Cold, hunger, injury, childbirth, infection, age and accident were close to the body, close to sleep, close to the place where a fire burned low at night. People must have known, in ways we can only approach carefully, that the living face was fragile. A face could be remembered, mourned, perhaps spoken of, perhaps touched one last time, but it could not stay. Then, in one ancient place, many thousands of years before written history, something unusual appears in the archaeological record. A skull was not left as bone alone. Human hands shaped a new surface over it. They covered the old structure with plaster, building up the suggestion of cheeks, eyelids, a nose, and features that had already vanished from the body itself. In the spaces where eyes had once been, shells were placed, creating not sight but the image of sight. The result was not a living person, and it was not only a skull. It stood in the uneasy space between body and memory, between remains and recognition. To look at such an object today is to feel how little separates archaeology from ordinary human feeling. We do not need to invent a dramatic story around it. The object itself is quiet enough and strange enough. It asks why a community, still close to the beginnings of settled life, would spend time bringing a face back after nature had removed it. It asks why the head became the place where memory was repaired. It asks why a dead person, or someone connected to the dead, needed to be seen again in a form that was neither fully real nor fully symbolic. Near the beginning of village life, when humans were learning to stay in one place long enough for houses, burials, and memories to gather together, the face may have become more than appearance. It may have become a point where biology, grief, belonging, and place met in one small human object. But the first thing to understand is not yet the answer. It is the feeling that makes the question possible. We know, in our own bodies, that a face is not just something we see. It is how a person arrives. To stand before the ancient skull from Jericho is to meet something that does not fit easily into the categories of the modern mind. It is not a portrait in the ordinary sense. because there was no canvas, no painted likeness, no attempt to preserve a person through the tools we expect from later history. It is not simply a burial object either, because the skull itself had been changed. Someone had taken what remained of a human head and worked over it with care. The surface of bone was covered with plaster. The missing flesh was not restored exactly, but suggested. A nose rose again where only bone should have remained. The cheeks were softened into a human outline. The empty places of the eyes were filled with shells, pale and still, giving the impression that the skull had not been abandoned to silence. It had been brought back into a shape that the living could recognize. The place connected with this object was Jericho, one of the oldest known settlements in the world, in the Jordan Valley, near springs that made life possible in a dry landscape. But the Jericho of nearly 9,500 years ago was not a city in the way modern people use that word. There were no written records telling us what people believed. There were no kings leaving inscriptions, no temples with carved stories, no documents explaining the names of the dead. What remains is more difficult, and in some ways more intimate. Houses, floors, walls, tools, burials, bones, and the traces of repeated human attention. These traces do not speak clearly, but they do not say nothing. They show that people were living in a world where the old moving life of human groups was beginning to change. For hundreds of thousands of years before such villages, humans and their close relatives had survived by moving through landscapes, following food, water, seasons, animals, and edible plants. Camps could be remembered, revisited, left behind, and found again. But a settled place changes the relationship between the living and the dead. When people remain near the same spring, build floors over the same ground, repair walls, store food, and raise children in the same cluster of dwellings, memory begins to gather in one location. A person does not only belong to a group, they begin to belong to a place. A death in such a world may leave more than grief. It may leave a question about who remains connected to the house, to the ground, to the people who continue sleeping and waking nearby. The plastered skull sits exactly inside that deeper change. It is small enough to be held in human hands, yet it carries the weight of a turning point in human life. The object does not allow us to say, with certainty, what was in the minds of the people who made it. Archaeology must be careful here. A skull with a face is not a sentence written by the dead. It is a material act, and material acts can have more than one meaning. It may have been tied to memory, it may have been tied to kinship. It may have been tied to the presence of ancestors, or to rights over a household, or to rituals we can no longer reconstruct. The danger is to answer too quickly, as if ancient people left behind a simple explanation waiting for us. They did not. They left a skull that had been made visible again. That is enough to slow the mind down. Imagine the room in which such an object may once have been seen, not as a museum display, but as something held within a living community. Around it were bodies that still breathed, hands that still worked, children learning faces, adults recognizing one another in the soft light of a house. Outside, the world still required food, water, fire, tools, and cooperation. Inside, a dead face had been remade from bone, plaster, and shell. The skull did not bring the person back, yet it refused to let the person become. Only remains. It stood at the edge between loss and continuation, asking the living to look again. The strangest thing about the plastered skull is not that it belongs to the dead. Every human community has had to face the dead. The stranger thing is that the skull was changed after death, after the face had already passed beyond reach. In the ordinary course of the body, death removes the signs by which one person is known. The warmth leaves first. The voice disappears. The skin no longer holds its living tension. The eyes, which once followed movement and met the eyes of others, become empty spaces. What remains is not the person as the living knew them, but a frame, a hard shape, a silent structure beneath all the vanished signs. Yet in Jericho, someone looked at that structure and did not let it remain only bone. The skull was taken into human attention again. A surface was made over it. The empty face was given form. The missing eyes were answered with shells. The dead had lost the body, but the living gave back an image of presence. That is the quiet contradiction at the center of the object. It does not erase death. It does not pretend that death has not happened. Nothing about plaster, shell, or bone could make a person breathe again. But the act still pushes against disappearance. It says, without words, that something about this person, or this head, or this connection was not allowed to dissolve as quickly as flesh. To understand why that matters, we have to remember how deep the human need for recognition may be. Long before agriculture, long before permanent villages, long before the houses of early Jericho, human beings lived by knowing faces in small groups. A stranger's face, a mother's face, an elder's face, the face of someone returning from a dangerous place, the face of someone injured or hungry or angry. All of these carried information. The face was not decoration, it was survival made visible. To read a face was to know where one stood among others. To be recognized was to belong. For a species born from cooperation, shared food, warning calls, care for children, and long dependence inside groups, recognition was not a small thing. It was one of the ways life held together. When a face vanished after death, something social vanished with it. The person could still be remembered, but the living no longer had the same visible point of return. A name, if names were spoken then in ways we cannot recover, would have lived only in sound. A story would have depended on memory. But a remade face could sit in space. It could be seen by more than one person. It could be approached, kept, perhaps placed, perhaps brought out, perhaps hidden again. We must be careful not to turn these possibilities into certainty. The people of Neolithic Jericho did not leave an explanation beside the skull. They left an action. Still, the action has weight. It required choosing the skull. It required preparing material. It required shaping the surface where the living face had once been. It required giving attention to features that death had removed. In a world where food, water, heat, shelter, and safety still demanded daily labor, attention itself was a kind of offering. The more we slow down, the more this effort becomes difficult to dismiss. A skull could have been buried and left. It could have remained unseen beneath a floor or in the earth. Instead, at least in some cases, the head was treated as something that could carry more than remains. The face was made again, not perfectly, not as an exact portrait in the modern sense, but enough to create recognition or the memory of recognition. This is where the object becomes more than an archaeological curiosity. It shows a human community standing close to a boundary every generation must face. The boundary between a person who is present and a body that is no longer a person in the same way. Near the early roots of settled life, when humans were beginning to gather time inside houses and places, that boundary may have felt especially important. The dead did not simply disappear into open land. Their traces could remain under the same roofs, near the same floors, inside the same human world. A remade face may have helped the living hold that presence without fully understanding, or perhaps without needing to explain, what they were holding. It was neither life nor simple absence. It was a human answer to a loss that bone alone could not carry. Jericho begins not as the city that later ages imagined, but as a place where water, earth, and repeated human return slowly changed the meaning of home. In the Jordan Valley, near a spring that could support life in a dry landscape, people gathered long before writing gave names to rulers, battles, or beliefs. Nearly 9,500 years ago, the people connected with the plastered skull lived in what archaeologists call the pre-pottery Neolithic B, a time when some communities in the Levant had begun to settle, build, cultivate plants, manage animals in early ways, and reshape daily life around more permanent places. The phrase can sound distant and technical, but the human meaning is simpler. These were people living after the Long Age, when most humans moved through the world in small, flexible groups, and before the later world of metals, states, armies, and written law. They stood in between. Their lives were still close to hunger, weather, disease, injury, and the demands of the body. Yet, they were also learning what happens when a group stays near the same ground long enough for houses to be rebuilt, floors to be repaired, and memories to settle beneath the feet. That middle position matters deeply for the skull with a face. If people are always moving, the dead are often left in landscapes that continue without the group. A grave may be visited, remembered, or avoided, but the living path keeps changing. When people begin to remain, Death begins to share space with daily life in a different way. A body can be buried near a house. A floor can cover older remains. A child can grow up where earlier generations had slept, worked, eaten, and died. The ground itself starts to hold a community's past. Jericho at this time was not a modern city, and it is important not to imagine streets, markets, written records, or public monuments in the later sense. It was a very early settlement, shaped by mud brick architecture, shared labour, storage, food production, and a new kind of closeness between people and place. The old human body, evolved for movement across changing environments, was now being asked to live with repetition. Wake in the same area, repair the same wall, return to the same hearth, know the same neighbours across seasons, bury the dead near the same inhabited ground. This may sound quiet, but it was one of the great shifts in human history. Not a single sudden invention, not one clean beginning, but a slow rearrangement of life. Food was still uncertain, childhood was still vulnerable, illness had no modern protection. The night still came without electricity, and the body still slept close to soil, smoke, animals, and other breathing people. Yet the social world was becoming denser. More people could live near one another for longer stretches of time. Kinship, memory, obligation, and conflict may have deepened around the same walls and floors. In such a world, the dead were not simply gone into distance. They could remain part of the physical environment the living touched every day. The plastered skull belongs to this threshold. It is not only a strange object found by archaeologists. It is a sign from a time when human beings were beginning to anchor themselves in place, and when that anchoring may have changed how they remembered those who came before. A face remade on a skull makes more sense when the ground itself is becoming a container of memory. The question is no longer only why someone shaped plaster over bone. It is why a community at the edge of settled life needed the dead to have a visible place among the living. The answer cannot be forced, but the setting narrows the mystery. This was not decoration floating outside daily survival. It was an act made in a world where staying put made the past heavier, nearer, and harder to leave behind. The settlement around ancient Jericho should be imagined slowly, not as a crowded city with noise and stone streets, but as a cluster of human lives pressed close to a dependable source of water. The spring mattered because water allowed return. Return allowed building. Building allowed memory to thicken in one place. Houses were made from earth, mud brick, plastered surfaces, and the repeated labour of people who knew that walls needed repair and floors needed renewal. These were not the large houses of later civilizations. They were human shelters shaped by hands, bodies, seasons, and necessity. Inside them, people cooked, slept, stored food, mended tools, cared for children, and watched one another age. Outside them, the dry land still held its old demands. The human body was not free from the ancient pressures that had shaped it for so long. Feet still walked over rough ground. Hands still carried water, plants, fuel, stone, and clay. Hunger still had to be answered by work. Illness could still pass from body to body. A wound could still threaten life. This was not comfort replacing survival. It was survival becoming more settled, more crowded, more tied to walls and floors. That change matters because the dead entered a different kind of world. In a mobile life, the living may carry memory forward while the body remains behind. In a settled life, the body can remain near the living. The dead may be placed beneath floors, beside houses, or within the same broader space where daily life continues. Archaeologists have found burials associated with domestic areas in several Neolithic communities of the Levant, and this does not mean every burial had the same meaning. It does show that the border between the living place and the resting place of the dead was not always the border many modern people expect. A house could be more than shelter. It could become a container of time. The floor underfoot might have covered older human presence. The walls might have stood near the memory of someone who once helped build them, slept inside them, or belonged to the people still living there. For people whose ancestors had spent immense stretches of human history moving with weather, animals, and food, this was a profound shift. The beginning of settlement did not only change diet or architecture, it changed the emotional shape of place. A child born in such a community might grow up surrounded not merely by living relatives, but by the hidden traces of earlier ones. A person might sleep above ground that already held the dead. A family, if we may use that word carefully, could feel tied not only to blood, but to a particular house, a particular courtyard, a particular patch of earth near water. In that setting, a skull remade with plaster begins to feel less like an isolated mystery and more like a sign of a new relationship with time. The dead were not far away, in a distant landscape. They could be near enough to be remembered through objects, remains, and places. Yet nearness alone does not explain the face. A buried body can be near without being given new features. A skull can be kept without being shaped into a human likeness. Something more precise was happening. The living were not only preserving bone, they were restoring a point of recognition. The face is where closeness becomes visible. It is where age, kinship, emotion, and identity gather in a way the body recognizes before language completes the thought. In the dim interior of a mud brick house, among storage bins, woven materials, tools, food remains, sleeping bodies, and the smell of earth, smoke, and human life, a plastered skull would not have been an abstract symbol. It would have occupied space as a made presence. It may have reminded people of someone, or of a line of people, or of a connection to the ground that could not be spoken in the way later written cultures would speak it. We cannot know the exact feeling. We can only follow the traces left behind. But the setting teaches us something important. When humans began to live longer in one place, the past no longer stayed behind on the trail. It gathered under the floor, inside the house, near the spring, and sometimes, perhaps, in a face remade from bone and plaster. A remade face only becomes fully strange when it is placed inside the slow birth of settled life. For most of the human story, the ground beneath a group did not hold them for very long. People moved because the living world moved. Animals shifted across plains and valleys. Plants ripened in one season and vanished in another. Water could draw a group close, then drought could push them away. Cold, heat, hunger, and danger were not background conditions. They were the shape of existence. The human body, with its walking feet, gripping hands, social mind, and long childhood, was formed inside this older rhythm of movement and return. Memory travelled mainly in bodies, voices, skills, gestures, and shared paths. A place could be important, but it did not always become a permanent container of the dead. Near Jericho, that rhythm was changing. People were beginning to live with a different kind of time. A spring could hold attention across generations. Mud brick walls could be repaired instead of abandoned. Floors could be made, worn down, resurfaced, and lived on again. Food could be stored, work could become tied to the same settlement. Children could learn the shape of the same rooms where older people had once moved. This was not the sudden beginning of modern life, and it should not be made too simple. The shift toward farming and settlement happened unevenly, with many local differences, and people still relied on a mixture of practices. But even a partial move towards staying in one place changes what memory can do. When the living remain, the dead remain differently. A burial is no longer only a place passed on a route. It can become part of the ground beneath ordinary life. The house, the floor, and the settlement begin to collect layers of human presence. A wall may stand near where someone once slept. A hearth may be rebuilt where earlier hands tended fire. A child may grow up above soil that holds bodies from a previous generation. The past becomes not a story carried away, but something underfoot. The plastered skull belongs to this new heaviness of place. If the skull had been only a bone from a grave, it would still have mattered. Human remains always carry the seriousness of a life that ended, but the act of giving it a face again suggests a more focused kind of attention. The community did not simply accept what time had left behind. They used material from the world around them to shape absence into a form that could be seen. The skull became a meeting point between the body's biological remains and the social need to remember. In a small settlement, where people likely knew one another by voice, movement, family connection, work, and face, such an object may have carried a power that is difficult for us to name. It could have connected the living to someone who had died. It could have marked belonging to a household. It could have been part of a ritual act whose meaning has not survived. It could have done several of these things at once. Care is needed because archaeology rarely gives one clean answer for an object this old, but the link between settled life and remembered people is hard to ignore. Once humans began to stay near the same ground, the question of who had been there before became more important. Who belonged to the house? Who belonged to the group? Who had lived, worked, and died near the same walls? Who gave weight to the place before the present generation arrived? A face made on a skull may have helped turn those questions into something visible. Not a written record, not a biography, not a portrait in the later artistic sense. A visible presence. The ancient makers did not need to leave us words for us to see that effort was spent where effort did not serve hunger directly. Plaster did not feed anyone. Shell eyes did not protect a wall from weather. A modelled face did not bring back a harvest. Yet human beings have never lived by calories alone. From the beginning, survival depended on bonds between people, and bonds do not end neatly when one body stops breathing. In the early settled world around Jericho, those bonds could settle into the architecture itself. The dead could become part of the place where the living continued. A skull given a face again may be one of the clearest signs that, as humans learn to stay, they also learn to live with a deeper nearness to those who had already gone. After death, the face is among the first human truths to leave. This is not a poetic idea first, but a biological one. The living face depends on soft tissues that cannot stay. Skin holds its shape because blood moves beneath it, because muscles keep slight tension, because warmth and circulation help the body remain itself. The eyes seem to hold attention because they are living organs, wet, reflective, responsive to light and movement. The mouth is familiar because lips, cheeks, jaw, tongue and breath all work to make expression and speech. When life ends, these signs begin to fail. The face does not disappear all at once, but it stops being the face the living knew. It becomes quieter, flatter, stranger. The person who could once be recognized from across a room slowly becomes something the mind struggles to place. What remains longest is the skull, the underlying frame that shaped the face but never fully was the face. The skull can suggest where eyes sat, where the nose rose, where teeth met, where the jaw moved, and where muscles once pulled expression across bone. It can preserve the architecture of a human head, but not the softness that made the person present. This is why the plastered skull from ancient Jericho feels so powerful. The people who worked over it were not beginning with nothing. They were beginning with the one part of the head that could survive after the rest had gone. Bone gave them a structure. The missing flesh gave them a problem. Plaster offered a way to answer that problem without truly solving it. They could not restore a living face. They could only make the skull carry the memory of one. In the long background of human origins, this matters because our species did not evolve to understand people as skeletons. We evolved among moving faces. A baby studies faces before it understands the world. A child learns safety through repeated expressions. Adults read one another through tiny changes in gaze, mouth, tension, and posture. For early humans, whose survival depended on cooperation, caregiving, shared danger, and knowledge passed from person to person, the face was one of the main places where social life appeared. To see a face was to meet a mind, or at least to feel that another mind was near. A skull alone does not give that feeling in the same way. It is human, but emptied of response. It can be recognized as a human remain, yet it does not look back. The ancient act of adding plaster to bone seems to sit inside that gap. It begins with the skull's endurance and tries to pull it closer to the lost face. The nose, the cheeks, the covered bone, the shell eyes, all of these details suggest that the makers were concerned not only with keeping remains, but with shaping a visible human presence. There is a deep difference between preserving a fragment of the body and restoring the place where recognition once happened. A hand bone can speak of work. A tooth can speak of diet, age, or illness. A femur can speak of movement. But the skull, especially the front of the skull, comes nearest to identity as the living experience it. It is where others once looked. It is where names, if spoken, attach themselves to appearance. It is where grief returned in memory. This does not mean the skull was meant to be a portrait in the exact modern sense. The features may not have matched the person with precision, the shells did not see, the plaster did not live, yet the choice of the head was not random. It used the most recognizable remaining structure of the body to approach what death had removed. The object holds that tension calmly. It is bone, but treated as more than bone. It is a face, but not a living face. It is a human remain, but also a made thing. Near the beginning of settled life, that combination may have allowed the living to hold someone at the edge of disappearance, not by denying death, but by giving memory a shape it could still look toward. Long before people shaped plaster over the skull at Jericho, the human head had already become one of the most important places where life was understood. This does not mean early humans had the same beliefs everywhere, or that we can read their thoughts directly from bone. It means something more basic, something rooted in the body itself. The head is where a person looks from. It is where the eyes turn toward food, danger, kin, strangers, and children. It is where the mouth calls, eats, speaks, breathes, and cries. It is where hearing gathers sound from the dark. It is where the face changes faster than any other visible part of the body. For a social animal, the head is not just anatomy, it is the front edge of presence. When another person approaches, we do not first read the knees or the ribs. We look to the face because the face tells us whether someone has noticed us, whether they are calm, afraid, angry, tired, familiar, or unknown. This habit reaches far beneath modern culture. It belongs to the long human beginning, to the time when survival depended on knowing who was near and what they might do next. A group moving through an ancient landscape needed bodies that could walk, hands that could gather and make, but also minds that could read other minds through visible signs. The face became one of those signs. It allowed cooperation before long explanation. It allowed warning before full understanding. It allowed an infant to find care, and an adult to sense grief, threat, or recognition in another person. When we bring that older human background to the plastered skull, the act feels less like an isolated curiosity and more like a deep response to a very old problem. Death removes the active face, but the living mind still searches for it. The skull is the last strong structure near that lost point of recognition. It is not hard to understand why ancient people might have treated it differently from other bones, though we must still be careful about saying exactly what they believed. Across many human societies, separated by time and place, the head has often carried special attention in burial, memory, conflict, ritual, or identity. That does not prove that Jericho meant the same thing as any other culture. It only reminds us that the human head has repeatedly been more than a piece of the skeleton. It is linked to recognition because in life it held the face. It is linked to voice because speech came from it. It is linked to awareness because the eyes looked out from it. Even without written doctrine, people could have felt that the head remained close to who someone had been. Near the early settlements of the Neolithic Levant, that feeling may have taken material form. A skull could be separated, handled, covered, modelled, and given a surface that pulled it back toward personhood. The plaster did not need to be perfectly realistic to matter. It only needed to guide the living eye toward a human presence. The shell eyes are especially important in this quiet logic. They do not restore sight, yet they fill the place where sight once appeared. They make the skull seem less empty. They turn hollow sockets into a kind of gaze. For a species that has always been sensitive to being seen, even the suggestion of eyes can change the feeling of an object. A stone, a tool, or a wall can be looked at without the sense that it looks back. A skull with eyes, even false eyes, enters a different emotional space. It may create a presence that is still, silent, and impossible to question, but not fully absent. That is why the head matters in the story of this 9,500-year-old skull. It was the part of the body where the living person had most visibly met the world. It was also the part that could survive long enough for the living to work upon it. Between biology and memory, between the vanished face and the enduring bone, the ancient makers found a place where loss could be shaped. They did not have to explain it in words for the act to reveal something recognizably human. When a person disappears, the living often return to the place where that person once looked back. A skull can keep the shape of a human head, but it cannot tell us by itself what the living believed. This is where the mystery of the plastered skull must remain careful. It is tempting to look at the modelled face, the shell eyes, the restored nose, and say that we know exactly what ancient people were doing. We might want to call it ancestor worship, or a portrait of a loved one, or a guardian of the house, or proof that the dead were thought to remain among the living. Some of these ideas may be possible. Some may even be likely in a broad sense. But possibility is not the same as certainty. The people of early Jericho left no written explanation beside the skull. They left no sentence saying who the person was, why the skull was chosen, how it was used, or what feeling surrounded it. What they left was an act performed on bone. To understand that act honestly, we have to stay close to what can be seen. A human skull was separated from the rest of the body. It was covered with plaster. Facial features were modelled where soft tissues had vanished. Shells were placed where the eyes had been. The result was a human head made present again after death, but not returned to life. That is already enough. It tells us that the skull mattered beyond ordinary disposal. It tells us that the face, or the memory of a face, was worth labour. It tells us that the living were willing to handle the dead with a kind of focused intention. What it does not tell us, at least not directly, is the exact inner world of the makers. This careful distance is not weakness. It is part of how truthful history has to work when it reaches so far back. Near the beginnings of settled life, humans were making choices that still feel familiar to us, but the meanings around those choices may have been very different from our own. A modern person may see a face and think of identity, grief, family memory, or psychological presence. An ancient community may have understood the same object through kinship, household continuity, ritual obligation, land connection, social authority, or ideas of the dead that no longer survive. These meanings could overlap. The skull might have been connected to one person, or to a lineage, or to a house, or to a wider pattern of remembering the dead. It may have been seen often, or hidden most of the time. It may have brought comfort, warning, status, continuity, or something we cannot easily translate. The important point is that the object held together two things: the durable remains of the body and the living need to give those remains a human form. That connection reaches back into the human beginning. Our species did not become human only by making tools or walking long distances. We also became human by carrying others in memory. A group could not survive if each person mattered only while visibly alive. Children depended on adults for years. Skills depended on teaching. Food knowledge depended on older memory. Social life depended on knowing who had done what, who could be trusted, who had cared, who had harmed, who belonged. Death did not erase those relationships from the minds of the living. It changed them. The person could no longer answer, but their place in the group might still remain. In a settled community, that remaining place could become tied to a house, a floor, a burial, or a skull that had been made visible again. The plastered skull may therefore be understood not as a solution, but as a preserved question. It shows us that the head could carry a special role because it was the last structure nearest to the vanished face. It shows that ancient people sometimes worked directly on the boundary between person and remains. It shows that the living did not always treat death as a clean disappearance, but it does not allow us to close the case. The most honest reading is also the most human one. Someone, or some group, took the part of the body that still held the form of a face and shaped it toward recognition. They may have believed the dead remained present. They may have needed the ancestors' clothes. They may have been marking belonging in a world where place had become precious. Or they may have been doing something whose meaning has slipped beyond the reach of language and time. The skull does not speak. It only keeps the trace of hands that tried to make absence visible. To make a face from plaster, the ancient makers had to do more than feel grief or remember the dead. They had to work with materials. They had to understand, through practice rather than written science, how earth, minerals, water, heat and hands could be turned into a surface that would hold a shape. This is easy to overlook, because the finished skull draws the eye toward the human face. We look at the shell eyes first. We notice the modelled cheeks, the softened brow, the strange stillness of a person who is neither present nor gone. But behind that face is labour. Plaster does not appear by itself. It has to be prepared. It has to be chosen, mixed, carried, pressed, smoothed, and watched as it changes from soft matter into a hardened surface. In the early Neolithic world, every one of these steps mattered. A community still living close to hunger and weather did not spend effort without reason. The human body at this time still knew the old pressures of survival, the ache of carrying loads, the need to gather fuel, the care required to keep fire, the repeated strain of grinding, building, lifting, repairing, and walking. Hands were tools before tools were held. They shaped stone, pulled plants, scraped hides, carried children, built walls, and prepared food. Those same hands, or hands like them, shaped plaster over a skull. That connection is important. The face was not only imagined, it was made through physical work. The act tied memory to technology, and technology to the body. Human beings had been making things for a very long time before Jericho. Stone tools go back far beyond farming, far beyond houses, far beyond the settled world of the Neolithic. But the making of plaster belongs to a different kind of transformation. It does not simply sharpen an edge or break a stone into a useful form. It changes raw material through process. Limestone, when heated and treated, can become lime plaster. Clay, earth, water, and mineral mixtures can become surfaces for floors, walls, and modelled forms. The exact methods varied, and we should not imagine a single simple recipe. But the broader point remains. People were learning to create artificial surfaces that could cover, seal, smooth, and reshape the world around them. In houses, plaster could make floors and walls more durable, cleaner, and more controlled. On a skull, it could do something far stranger. It could replace vanished flesh with a made surface. It could turn a hard remnant of the body into something closer to the remembered human front. This is where the plastered skull becomes part of the larger human story. Our species did not only adapt by changing biologically, we adapted by extending the body outward through tools, fire, shelters, containers, clothing, and built places. A hand could not become a wall, but hands could build walls. Skin could not resist every cold night, but humans could make coverings and shelters. Memory could not stop a face from fading, but people could shape material over bone and create a visible form for remembrance. The skull from Jericho sits inside this same long pattern. It shows human beings using the outside world to answer an inner difficulty. Yet it is different from a tool for hunting, or cutting, or grinding, because its usefulness is not obvious in the practical sense. It did not harvest grain. It did not protect a child from cold. It did not carry water. Its purpose, whatever it was, belonged to the social and emotional world. That makes the effort even more revealing. In a small early settlement, time and fuel and skilled attention were valuable. If a skull was plastered, then the act had weight for the people involved. It may have been a ritual obligation, it may have been an act of memory, it may have helped bind a house to its dead, it may have made a particular person or a particular relationship visible again. We cannot say which meaning was primary, but we can see that material skill was being used for something beyond daily function. The dead face had vanished because biology could not preserve it. The living answered with craft. They took what the body left behind and what the earth could provide, then joined them together in a form that still unsettles us after thousands of years. A skull became the base. Plaster became the skin of memory. Shells became eyes without sight. Human hands became the bridge between loss and form. The skill behind the plastered skull did not begin with the dead. It began with the older human habit of changing the world by touching it, heating it, breaking it, mixing it, and making it hold a new shape. Long before Jericho, long before people lived beside permanent walls, human hands had already learned that nature could be persuaded. A stone could be struck until it became an edge. A branch could become a digging stick. Fire could turn raw food softer, safer, warmer, and easier to share. A hide could become covering. A shelter could turn wind into something bearable. In this long history, the human body survived not because it was the strongest body on earth, but because it could place skill between itself and danger. The body was vulnerable, but the hand could make. The skin was thin, but fire and shelter could help. Teeth were limited, but tools could cut. Memory alone could fade, but material could hold a trace longer than a voice. The plastered skull belongs to this ancient human pattern, yet it turns that pattern inward toward death. It uses technology not to kill an animal, store food, or build a wall, but to approach the loss of a face. That is what makes it so quietly important. The same broad capacity that let humans reshape stone, heat, earth, and bone also allowed them to reshape the remains of a person into something that could be seen differently. Plaster is a humble material, but it carries a deep idea. It begins as matter from the landscape, altered by human process. It can be spread over floors, smoothed over walls, and used to create surfaces that feel cleaner, brighter, more controlled than rough earth. In early settled communities, such materials help turn shelters into lived spaces that could be maintained over time. A floor is not only something beneath the feet, it is a sign that people expect to return. A repaired surface means tomorrow matters. A wall covered again means a place is being held against weather, dust, and decay. When the same material logic is placed on a skull, the meaning changes, but the movement is related. The rough and exposed structure of bone is covered. The uneven border between remains and memory is smoothed. The skull is brought into the same world of made surfaces as the house itself. The living had already begun to shape the ground where they slept. Now they shaped the head of someone dead. Near the roots of settled life, this joining of body and material may have felt natural in ways that are hard for us to recover. The earth gave building material. Fire changed it. Water mixed it. Hands pressed it into place. The skull, too, came from the human body but returned to the world of earth and mineral. By placing plaster over bone, the makers created a meeting of two kinds of endurance, the endurance of the skeleton and the endurance of a made surface. Both outlasted flesh. Both resisted disappearance more successfully than skin, breath, or expression. This was not modern science, but it was careful knowledge. People knew from repeated experience what materials could do. They knew what hardened, what cracked, what held, what softened, what could be repaired. Such knowledge came from daily life, from building houses, preparing spaces, and using the environment with patient attention. In that sense, the plastered skull was not made outside the practical world. It came from the same world that built rooms, floors, storage areas, and communal life near water. Yet it turned practical knowledge toward an object with no obvious practical use. That contrast is the center of the question. Why use skill on a skull? Why spend time shaping a face that could not speak, eat, work, or protect the group? The answer cannot be reduced to one simple reason, but the effort itself shows that ancient humans were not only solving physical needs, they were also shaping relationships, memories, and perhaps obligations that continued after death. The skull was not repaired because bone needed skin. It was remade because the living may have needed a form through which the dead, or the idea of the dead, could remain socially present. This is where technology becomes more than technique. It becomes a bridge between what the body loses and what a community tries to hold. In the plaster, we see not only material skill, but a human decision to give labor to absence. A community that could shape plaster over a skull was a community capable of spending precious effort on something that did not solve the next hunger. That is the part of the object that should slow us down. In the early settled world around Jericho, daily life was not easy. Food did not arrive without labor. Water had to be carried or managed. Firewood had to be gathered. Floors and walls had to be repaired. Tools had to be made, maintained, and replaced. Children needed care for many years, and the sick or injured could place weight on the whole group. The human body still lived close to the pressures that had shaped it from the beginning. Fatigue, weather, wounds, thirst, infection, the long effort of staying alive with other people. In such a world, time was never empty. Hands that worked on plaster could also have worked on shelter, food, baskets, grinding stones, clothing, or fire. Yet some hands were directed toward the face of the dead. That choice gives the plastered skull its quiet force. It was not only made because material skill existed, it was made because someone, or some group, decided that this use of skill mattered. A skull could have been left alone. It could have been buried without alteration. It could have remained as a private memory held only in speech or silence. Instead, the remaining structure of the head was turned into a made object. The dead person, or the dead presence, was given a visible form that required preparation and care. This does not prove a single belief. It does not let us say that every plastered skull meant the same thing, or that every person in the settlement understood it in one way. But effort is evidence of value. Human groups do not repeatedly invest labour in acts that mean nothing to them. The exact meaning may be lost, but the seriousness of the act remains. The skull asked for a kind of work that belonged neither fully to survival nor fully outside it. This is important because humans have never survived by food alone. From the earliest roots of our species, survival depended on the group. A person needed care as an infant, knowledge from older people, warnings from companions, shared labour, and recognition inside a social world. The body needed calories, but the person needed belonging. A child who was not noticed did not survive well. An adult who was not trusted could be pushed toward danger. An elder who carried knowledge could matter beyond physical strength. These social bonds were not decoration added after survival. They were part of survival itself. So when a community spent effort on the dead, the act may still have belonged to the wider system that kept life together. Remembering someone, marking a household, keeping a lineage visible, maintaining obligations, or holding the presence of past people near the living could all have had practical consequences in a settled community, even if they were expressed through ritual and feeling rather than through tools of food production. Near Jericho, where people were learning to remain in one place, the dead may have become part of the way a group understood itself across time. A remade face could have helped turn memory into something shared. One person's recollection fades inside one mind, but an object can be seen by many eyes. It can remain in a house, a hidden place, a ritual setting, or a remembered location. It can gather attention again and again. This is one reason the plastered skull feels different from ordinary remains. It transforms memory from a private inner image into a social surface. The face no longer depends only on someone closing their eyes and remembering. It is placed back into the world, where others can respond to it. Still, we should not make the object too soft or too simple. It may not have been only about love. It may have been about authority, ancestry, belonging, fear, duty, continuity, or the right of a group to say that this place held their dead. Human memory is rarely pure. It can comfort, but it can also bind. It can preserve affection, but it can also organize power. In an early village where houses, burials, food, and generations were becoming more closely tied together, a skull with a face may have carried more than grief. It may have helped the living understand who they were by looking toward those who were no longer alive. That is why the effort matters. Plaster did not bring the person back, and shell eyes did not restore sight, but the work made absence visible and placed it within the human world. The ancient makers gave labour to a face that could not answer, and in doing so, they left behind one of the oldest signs that humans were not only trying to survive the day, they were trying to make the dead remain meaningful among the living. In a modern mind, the dead are often placed somewhere apart. A cemetery may sit beyond the house, beyond the street, beyond the rooms where people cook, sleep, speak softly, and wake in the dark. This separation can feel so natural that it is easy to forget it has a history. Not all human communities have divided the living and the dead in the same way. In some early settled communities of the Neolithic Levant, burials were connected closely with domestic spaces. Bodies could be placed beneath floors, near houses, or within the area where everyday life continued. This does not mean every burial had the same meaning, and it does not mean the living felt about death exactly as modern people do. But it does show a different arrangement of space. The dead were not always sent far away from the world of the living. They could remain near the surfaces people walked over, near the walls people repaired, near the hearths where food was prepared, near the same ground where children grew up learning the faces and voices of their group. To understand the plastered skull, this closeness matters. A skull given a face again is not only an object of death, it is also an object of place. It belongs to a world where the house may have carried more than shelter. A house could hold work, sleep, memory, kinship, and the buried presence of those who had come before. For most of human evolution, our ancestors lived with shelters that were often temporary, flexible, and tied to movement. A camp could matter deeply, but it did not always collect generations in the same way a permanent dwelling could. When people began to build, repair, and return to the same domestic spaces, the ground under the body changed in meaning. A floor was no longer only a hard surface. It could become a layer over older living, older death, older memory. The human body, which had once slept in places chosen for a night, a season, or a return journey, now slept above a past that did not move away. This may have changed how people felt the presence of the dead. The dead could be below, near, remembered, perhaps invoked, perhaps feared, perhaps honoured, perhaps simply accepted as part of the continuing household. We should keep the words gentle here, because the evidence does not give us private emotions. Archaeology gives patterns, placements, materials, and changes in bones. It does not give us a person's whispered thought inside a mud brick room. Still, spatial choices are meaningful. Where a body is placed tells us something about how a community organized nearness and distance. If the dead are placed under a floor, they are not absent in the same way as someone lost far across a landscape. They become part of the place the living maintain. The same hands that sweep, smooth, build, grind, cook, and repair may live above human remains that tie the present to earlier people. In such a world, a skull could become especially powerful because it could be both near the dead and capable of being brought into visible attention. The body as a whole may rest in the earth, but the head, once separated and treated, could move between hidden and seen, between burial and presence. This is not a claim that every skull was displayed openly or constantly. The exact handling is often uncertain, but the possibility itself reveals a different relationship between death and domestic life. The living space was not cleansed of the dead. It could contain them, cover them, remember them, and perhaps return to them through selected remains. The plastered face sits inside that intimate architecture. Imagine not a grand temple, not a king's tomb, not a monument built to impress strangers, but a human-scale environment of earth walls, low light, stored food, tools, worn floors, and bodies resting close together at night. The skull with plaster and shell eyes would have belonged to the same kind of world as those ordinary things, yet it would not have been ordinary. It would have carried a stillness that no tool or pot or wall could carry. It would have drawn the living eye toward the question of who had been there before. In the deep beginning of settled life, memory was not yet written on tablets or carved into long inscriptions. It could be placed under floors. It could be held in bones. It could be shaped on a skull. The house, then, may have been one of the earliest places where human beings learned that the past could live very close to sleep. A floor can seem like the simplest part of a house. It lies under the feet, quiet and easily forgotten. But in an early settlement, a floor could be one of the most powerful surfaces in the world. It was where bodies rested at night. It was where children learned to crawl, sit, stand, and recognize the people around them. It was where food was prepared, where tools were placed, where tired legs folded after labor, where illness might be endured, where warmth from a hearth reached the skin. To live on the same floor again and again is to make a small piece of earth part of the body's memory. The feet know it, the knees know it. The sleeping body knows its hardness and temperature. In ancient Jericho and related Neolithic communities, such floors were not only surfaces of daily use, they could also lie close to the dead. Burials associated with houses remind us that the living place and the resting place of the dead were not always separate worlds. A person could wake, work, and sleep above ground that held earlier human remains. This should not be imagined as constant fear or sadness. It may have been ordinary within that culture. The dead may have been part of the house in a way that later societies would find unfamiliar. The important thing is the closeness. The past was not outside the settlement. It was not always beyond a gate, beyond a road, beyond a marked cemetery. It could be below the same space where life continued. This closeness changes how we think about the plastered skull. The skull was not simply a loose object from nowhere. It belonged to a world where houses, bodies, and memory could overlap. In the long human beginning, shelter had often been temporary. A group might make a camp, leave it, return to it, or forget it. Fireplaces, stone tools, bones, and footprints could remain behind, but the group's living world kept moving. With settlement, the body entered a different relationship with time. A wall repaired by one generation might still stand. When another generation came of age, a floor could be remade over older floors. A child might grow up in a place where the adults remembered who had died beneath or near the household. Even if no one explained it in words the way modern people would, the architecture itself could teach continuity. The house said, "Others were here before you." The ground said, "Life has passed through this place and has not entirely left." The skull with a remade face intensifies that message. A buried body may be hidden under the floor, but a treated skull can bring one part of the dead back toward visibility. It can make the hidden past momentarily present. Again, we must be careful. We do not know how often such skulls were seen, whether they were displayed, stored, handled during certain occasions, or kept in ways that would not match modern expectations. But the relationship between the skull and domestic space remains important. A remade face would have gained meaning from the world around it. Mud brick walls, plastered floors, hearths, tools, stored food, and the closeness of living bodies. It was not created in an empty symbolic universe. It was made in a household world, in a settlement where daily survival and remembered death shared the same ground. This is one of the quiet differences between a monument and a home. A monument may lift memory upward, making it visible from far away. A home holds memory inward, close to the skin. The plastered skull seems to belong more to that inward world. It suggests a memory that did not need height or grandeur. It needed nearness. A firsting. Near the source of settled human life, the dead could be woven into the physical place where the living continued to eat, sleep, and recognize one another. The face made from plaster may have been one way of allowing that nearness to become visible, not as a clear answer, but as a presence shaped into the space of ordinary life. The house is not only a shelter from weather, it is a way of deciding what belongs near the living body. In the modern world, we often think of a home as a place separated from death. The bed, the cooking space, the floor, the doorway, the walls, all seem to belong to ordinary life, while the dead are moved somewhere else, into a cemetery, a tomb, a hospital record, a memory held at a distance. But early settled communities did not always divide space in that way. Near the beginnings of village life, the house could gather what later societies might separate. It could hold sleep, food, birth, sickness, repair, tools, stored grain, family memory, and the bodies of those who had died. This does not mean the dead were treated casually. In fact, the closeness may suggest the opposite. A body placed beneath or near a domestic space was not simply thrown away from human attention, it became part of the ground around which life continued. The dead person was no longer walking, speaking, working, or eating, yet the place where they rested could remain woven into the movements of the living. A person might grind food above an older burial. A child might sleep near a floor that covered someone from a previous generation. Adults might repair a wall while knowing, or perhaps simply inheriting the knowledge, that the household held more lives than the ones currently breathing. For a species whose earliest story was shaped by movement, this was a new kind of nearness. Our ancestors had long carried memory in mobile ways, in stories, gestures, habits, paths, scars, and the learned skills of survival. But a settled house can hold memory physically. It can make the past stay in one place, even when the living mind forgets details. A buried body under a floor is not a story that depends only on speech. It is a presence built into the architecture. The plastered skull turns that hidden presence into something more visible and more difficult to ignore. If the body lies below, the head can become the point where the dead return toward the surface of social life. A skull with a face is therefore not only about death. It is about the domestic world becoming deep with time. It changes the meaning of the room. A room with only the living is one kind of space. A room connected to the remembered dead is another. The difference may be quiet, but it is not small. The living body senses space through repetition. The same doorway, the same low wall, the same floor, the same hearth, the same sleeping place become familiar through the skin and muscles before they become ideas. When the dead are placed within that familiar world, memory becomes bodily too. It is not placed far away as a distant event. It is near the feet, near the hands, near the breath at night. The skull with plastered features may have made that nearness more focused. It could have served as a visible point where people look toward the past held inside the house. Yet the word house must still be used carefully. These were not private modern homes with locked rooms and individual ownership in the later sense. They were early domestic spaces shaped by communal labour, kin relations and ways of living we can only partly reconstruct. The people of Jericho did not leave a manual of household meaning. They left architecture, burials, skulls, plaster, tools and patterns in the ground. From those traces we can see that the dead were sometimes integrated into the places where the living continued. That is enough to shift the question. Instead of asking only why a skull was decorated, we begin to ask why a society would make the dead part of the living environment. The answer may lie in the deep human need for continuity. A moving group carries continuity through people. A settled group can also carry continuity through place. The house becomes a memory device before writing exists. The floor becomes a quiet archive. The dead beneath or near it become part of the claim that life did not begin with the present generation. A remade face may have made that claim human-sized. Not a monument, not a written lineage, not a carved royal name, just a head, shaped again into the suggestion of someone who once belonged. In that way, the plastered skull stands between burial and home. It suggests that, for some ancient people, the dead were not pushed fully outside the circle of daily life. They remained close enough that memory could be walked over, slept above, and sometimes looked in the face. The word ancestor can sound simple, as if it only means someone who lived before us. But near the early roots of settled life, the idea may have carried a heavier weight. An ancestor was not only a person from the past in a distant family tree. In a small community living close to the same houses, same spring, same fields or gathering grounds, the dead of earlier generations may have helped define who belonged, who remembered, and who had a claim to the place. This is one of the major ideas scholars have considered when looking at plastered skulls from Jericho and other Neolithic sites in the Levant. The modelled skulls may have been connected to ancestor memory, household identity, or the continuing presence of important dead people among the living. That possibility fits the evidence in a broad way, because the skulls were treated with special care, given faces again, and associated with a world where domestic life and burial could be closely linked. But it must be said gently, we cannot hear the prayers. If there were prayers, we cannot know whether the people themselves would have used anything like the modern word ancestor. We cannot know whether they saw the skull as a loved person, a founding figure, a household protector, a dangerous presence, a social marker, or several of these things at once. The skull does not give us a belief system. It gives us a pattern of human attention. Still, the ancestor idea remains powerful because it helps explain why a face might matter so much in a settled world. When human groups lived more mobile lives, connection to earlier people could be carried through memory, naming, stories, roots, and repeated practices. The past travelled with the group, but when people began to remain in one place, the past could become fixed in earth, walls, and floors. The dead could become tied to a house. A skull with a face could make that tie visible. In that setting, remembering the dead may not have been only emotional, it may also have helped organise the living. A household that could point to its dead, or keep a visible sign of them, might be saying something about continuity. We were here before. Our people built here, slept here, died here, and remain connected to this ground. Again, this is not a statement we can put directly into the mouths of the ancient makers. It is a careful possibility suggested by the relationship between skulls, houses, burials, and early settlement. The human body itself helps us understand why such a possibility would feel meaningful. We are born into dependence on others. Our survival is not only biological but generational. Children survive because adults feed them, carry them, watch them, and teach them. Adults survive because knowledge is passed along, where water lies, which plants can be eaten, how tools are made when seasons change, how conflict is avoided, how a place is used. A community is never only the people alive at one moment. It is also the memory of people who taught, built, suffered, cared, and died before. In the deep human beginning, This chain of dependence was carried mostly without writing. Memory lived in bodies, habits, voices, gestures, and shared spaces. A plastered skull may have given that chain a visible center. It may have allowed the living to look towards someone who represented more than an individual death. Perhaps the person had been known directly. Perhaps the skull came to stand for a line of people. Perhaps it marked a household's connection to its own past. The uncertainty should remain, because honesty is part of the value of looking back. But uncertainty does not make the object empty. It makes it more human. Real human memory is rarely clean and simple. A dead parent, elder, or founder can be missed, honored, feared, depended upon, and used as proof of belonging all at once. The plastered skull may have stood inside that mixed space. Its face did not speak, yet it could gather the living around, a shared sense that the present generation was not alone. Others had come before. Others had held the place. Others had left their bones close enough that the living could still shape them into a presence. The further we look back, the more important it becomes to separate evidence from imagination. A plastered skull can easily pull the mind toward a complete story. We can picture a family gathered around it. We can picture an elder being honored. We can picture a dead person watching the house. We can picture ancestors protecting the living, or the living asking the dead for permission to remain on the land. These images may feel convincing because they fit the object so well, but feeling convincing is not the same as being proven. The people of early Jericho did not leave a written explanation. They did not tell us whether the skull was loved, feared, displayed, hidden, touched, inherited, or used in ceremonies. They did not tell us whether the person was male or female in a social sense, powerful or ordinary, remembered by name or transformed into something broader than a single life. What we have is the skull itself, the plaster, the shell eyes, the archaeological setting, and comparisons with other finds from the Neolithic Levant. From these, scholars can build careful interpretations. They can see patterns. They can ask why some skulls were treated differently. They can study where remains were found, how they were modified, and how they relate to houses and burials. But they cannot step directly into the private thoughts of the makers. That boundary must remain visible. It protects the truth of the story. Without it, the skull becomes whatever a modern narrator wants it to be. With it, the object stays more powerful, because it keeps its age and distance. This is especially important for a video about why ancient humans gave a skull a face again. The honest answer is not one answer, but a narrow field of possibilities. It may have been connected to ancestors. It may have been connected to household memory. It may have been a way of keeping certain dead people close to the living. It may have helped express continuity in a settlement where staying in place made the past heavier. It may have marked identity, belonging, status, or obligation. These ideas are not wild inventions. They come from the material pattern, but each one must be held with care. Archaeology works through traces, and traces are not the same as speech. A plastered face tells us that the living transformed the dead. It does not tell us exactly what words they used in their minds while doing it. In the deep human beginning, before writing, this silence is normal. Most human lives were never recorded in text. Their meanings were carried in bodies, tools, buildings, gestures, and repeated practices. A grinding stone tells us about work and food, but not the name of the person whose hands wore it down. A floor tells us people stayed, repaired, and returned, but not every memory spoken above it. A burial tells us a body was placed with intention, but not always whether that intention was grief, duty, fear, affection, or social rule. The plastered skull sits among these silent witnesses. It is more personal than a wall, because it carries a human head. It is more shaped than an ordinary burial, because someone gave it features. Yet it is still silent. That silence should not make us abandon the question. It should make us ask it more slowly. Why give effort to the dead face? Why use plaster and shell to rebuild the place where recognition once lived? Why choose the skull, the part of the body closest to the vanished person as others knew them? The safest answer is that the act made the dead socially present in some way. Not necessarily present as a ghost, not necessarily worshipped as a god, not necessarily remembered as a modern individual, but present enough to be shaped, kept, and seen. This phrasing matters because it leaves room for uncertainty while still respecting the evidence. The people of Jericho lived at a time when houses, burials, and settled memory were becoming deeply linked. Their world did not need writing for relationships to extend across generations. A skull with a remade face could have helped hold those relationships in material form. It may have been a bridge between body and community, between the person who had died and the group that continued. We cannot name the belief with confidence, but we can see the care, the selection, and the transformation. The skull does not give us a doctrine. It gives us a human act performed at the edge of loss. If the plastered skull was connected to ancestors, then an ancestor in that world may not have been a distant idea. It may not have been a name placed far back in a family line, separated from daily hunger, sleep, work, and weather. It may have been much closer than that. It may have been someone whose body had once moved through the same rooms, whose hands had once helped shape the same walls, whose voice may have been remembered by older people, whose death still belonged to the house. This is why the face matters. An ancestor without a face can become a general idea. A skull given a face pulls that idea back toward a human being. It brings the past down from abstraction and places it near the eyes of the living. We cannot know whether the people of Jericho thought in exactly these terms, but the object allows this careful possibility. The dead may have been remembered not only as bones beneath the ground, but as people whose presence still helped structure the living world. In a small settlement, the difference between memory and social order may have been thin. The people who had come before could give weight to the people still there. A house might not only be occupied by the living, it might be deepened by those who had lived there before. The skull with a restored face could have made that depth visible. It may have reminded the living that the present did not begin with them. It may have shown that the group was not just a collection of bodies alive at one moment, but a chain crossing time. This idea reaches back to something very old in human life. Long before villages, human survival depended on generations. A child learned from adults who had learned from older adults. Paths, plants, seasons, water sources, animal behavior, tool-making, dangers, and social rules were passed through living memory. No single person invented the whole world needed for survival. Each person entered a human field already shaped by others. In mobile groups, this inheritance moved with people. In settled communities, it could begin to settle into place. The dead under the floor, the skull kept near the house, the face remade in plaster, all could become ways of making that inheritance visible, not as writing, not as history, in the later sense, but as a presence that reminded the living that others had carried the group before them. If the skull belonged to someone remembered, then the plastered face may have helped hold that person in a form the community could return to. If it represented a broader line of dead people, then the face may have worked less like an individual portrait and more like a human sign of continuity. These possibilities are not the same, and we should not collapse them into one easy explanation. A face can belong to one person, but it can also stand for more than one person. It can gather memory, authority, belonging, grief, and time into a single visible surface. That is part of its power. The face is specific enough to feel human, but open enough to carry meaning beyond the individual. The skull at Jericho may have stood at that boundary. It may have been someone. It may have also been a reminder of those who came before someone. It may have allowed the living to feel that the dead were not only past, but still woven into the place where life continued. This would matter especially in a world where staying in one place was becoming more important. When people settle, land and memory begin to speak to one another. A group may need ways to say, without written documents, that this house, this spring, this ground, this set of relationships has history. The dead can become part of that history. Not because they own the land in a modern legal sense, but because their bodies and memories give the living a deeper connection to place. A plastered skull may have made such connection visible at human scale. It was small, but it could carry a large question. Who are we, if not only the living, but also those we continue to remember? The face did not answer. It did not explain whether it was loved, feared, honoured, or needed. It simply held the form of a person at the edge of disappearance. If this was ancestor memory, it was not a cold doctrine. It was a face made from bone, plaster, shell, and human attention. It was the past shaped so the present could look toward it. The eyes of the Jericho skull are among its quietest and most unsettling details. They are not eyes in the biological sense. They do not receive light, move towards sound, narrow in suspicion, soften in recognition, or follow a child crossing a room. They are shells placed into empty sockets, pale material answering a hollow space. Yet the moment shells are set where eyes had been, the skull changes. It no longer feels only like the front of a human cranium. It begins to suggest a gaze. Not a living gaze, not a seeing gaze, but the image of being seen. This is important because human beings are unusually sensitive to eyes. Even now, a drawn pair of eyes on a wall can make a person feel watched. A simple face-like pattern can pull attention before thought catches up. The body responds quickly to the possibility that another mind is looking back. This sensitivity has deep roots. For humans and other social animals, eyes carry information about direction, attention, intention, fear, calm, anger, and recognition. To know where another person is looking can help a group find food, avoid danger, protect children, or understand a sudden change in the environment. The eyes tell us not only that someone is alive, but that someone is oriented toward the world. In early human life, when survival depended on cooperation at close range, following another person's gaze could matter. A glance toward movement in the grass might warn of danger. A softened gaze might calm an infant. A fixed stare might signal threat. A look of recognition might restore belonging after absence. The eyes were never merely decorative features. They were part of the social nervous system of the group. This makes the shell eyes of the plastered skull especially meaningful, even if their exact meaning remains uncertain. The makers did not leave the sockets empty. They did not simply cover the skull with plaster and stop at the outline of a face. They placed something in the place of sight. They created the visual suggestion that the dead face still had a front, an orientation, perhaps even a presence directed outward. We must be careful here, because it would be too easy to say that they wanted the dead to watch over the living. That may be possible, but it is not proven. The safer observation is that the skull was made to look more face-like, and the eyes were a crucial part of that transformation. Without eyes, a face can feel incomplete. With eyes, even false ones, the mind begins to respond differently. The object enters the social space of looking. A skull without eyes is a human remain. A skull with eyes, even shell eyes, can feel like a silent participant. In the world of Jericho, this may have mattered deeply. The houses were not large public monuments. They were spaces of nearness, where bodies lived close to one another and where the dead may have remained tied to domestic ground. If a plastered skull was seen within such a setting, the shell eyes could have shaped how the living approached it. The object might have seemed not only kept, but present. It could face outward. It could hold attention. It could gather memory around a point where the living eye expected response, even while no response came. This tension is what gives the skull its power. The shells do not hide death. They make death more visible by placing the sign of life where life has disappeared. They remind us that the living human face is built around exchange. One face looks, another face answers. One person sees, another is seen. When death breaks that exchange, the mind may still search for it. Near the early beginning of settled life, when people were learning to keep the dead close to houses, floors, and inherited places, the shell eyes may have helped turn remains into a presence that could be encountered, not understood completely, not spoken for with certainty, encountered. The ancient makers took empty sockets and filled them with something that could never see, yet still changed how the skull was seen. They created a face that did not return the dead to life, but allowed the living to feel that absence had a direction. The human brain does not treat eyes as ordinary details. It gives them a special kind of attention. A face can be blurred, aged, painted, carved, or simplified, yet if the eyes are present, the mind often begins to feel that someone is there. This response is so quick that it can happen before we decide what we are seeing. 2 dark marks inside a round shape can become a face. A painted gaze can seem to follow us. A mask with empty features can feel lifeless. while the same mask with eyes can become strangely alert. This is not because we believe the object is alive. It is because the body has older habits than belief. For a social species, eyes are not just organs of sight. They are signals of attention. They show where another being is turned, what it may have noticed, whether it has seen us, whether it is afraid, calm, interested, or dangerous. In the long beginning of human life, before houses, before farming, before the settlement of Jericho, the ability to read eyes and gaze helped people live together. A mother could follow the gaze of a child. A hunter could notice where another person was looking. A group could share warning without many words. One pair of eyes shifting toward the edge of the firelight might change the attention of everyone nearby. In darkness, hunger, cold, and uncertainty, the eyes were part of the way human beings shared the world. This deep sensitivity helps us understand why the shell eyes in the plastered skull matter so much. The makers did not need to restore the whole body to change the object. They did not need to make it move or speak. By placing shells where the eyes had been, they created a sign that the skull had a front, a direction, a point of encounter. The skull could now face the living. It could be looked at, and it could seem, in a quiet and impossible way, to look back. We should not say too much too quickly. The shell eyes do not prove that people believed the skull could see. They do not prove that it watched over the house or guarded the living. Those ideas may be possible in some broad sense, but the evidence does not give us that certainty. What we can say is simpler and stronger. The eyes were important enough to be made. Empty sockets were not left empty. The absence left by death was filled with material that changed the emotional force of the face. In a human skull, the sockets are among the most hollow and unmistakable signs of death. They show where living sight has gone. To cover the skull with plaster but leave those openings dark would have preserved the emptiness. To place shells there gave the skull a different presence. It softened the emptiness without hiding it. It turned loss into a visible sign. The body had lost the living eye, but the community created an image of the eye. That movement from absence to image is one of the key human gestures in the entire object. It belongs to the same broad human ability that gave us tools, shelters, painted surfaces, ornaments, and later images of people, animals, and powers beyond ordinary sight. Human beings make forms where nature leaves gaps. We make marks where memory weakens. We create symbols where the body cannot remain. The shell eyes of Jericho may belong to that very old human tendency, but in a particularly intimate way. They were not placed on a wall far away from the dead. They were placed on the skull itself, in the hollow spaces of a human head. This means the object joined biological reality with social imagination. Bone said the person was gone. Plaster said the face could be approached again. Shell eyes said the place of seeing still mattered. In a settled community where the dead may have remained near houses and floors, such a face could have shaped how people felt the boundary between living and dead. A skull without eyes might remind the living of ending. A skull with eyes might remind them of relationship, not because it was alive, but because eyes are where relationship begins. A living person looks, and another person answers. The exchange is small, but it is one of the oldest foundations of human closeness. When ancient hands placed shells into the sockets, they may have been reaching toward that lost exchange. They could not restore sight. They could not restore voice, warmth, or breath. But they could restore the place where the living once met the person most directly. The shells did not make the dead see again. They made the living look differently. There is a quiet difference between looking at the dead and feeling that the dead look back. A skull by itself can be studied, mourned, feared, or avoided, but it does not easily enter the exchange that living faces create. It has sockets rather than eyes. It has teeth rather than a mouth. It has the shape of humanity without the signs of response. The shell eyes of the plastered skull change that balance. They do not bring life into the object, yet they create the image of direction. They make the face seem oriented towards someone. This may be the most delicate point in the whole object, because it touches a human feeling older than words. To be seen is one of the earliest experiences of life. An infant enters the world helpless, unable to feed itself, unable to walk, unable to survive alone. It learns safety through warmth, touch, voice, and faces leaning close. The gaze of another person is not a small detail. It tells the body that someone is there. Long before a child understands kinship, death, ancestry, or ritual, the child understands being looked at. The human nervous system grows inside that exchange. Later, as adults, we may use language, tools, houses, and rules, but some part of us still responds to eyes with the old intensity of dependence and recognition. In the deep human past, this mattered because group life was built from attention shared between bodies. A person who noticed danger could make others notice. A person who looked toward food could guide others without speech. A person who avoided another's gaze could signal tension. A person who returned the gaze of a familiar companion could restore trust after separation. Eyes helped turn many bodies into one social field. They allowed humans to live not as isolated animals, but as beings constantly adjusting to one another. When death removed the eyes, it removed more than organs. It removed a channel of relationship. The plastered skull could not restore that channel, but it could mark its absence in a powerful way. Shell eyes sit exactly where the exchange used to happen. They are still, but their placement makes the face readable. They allow the living mind to approach the skull as if it has a front, an address, a direction. This may have created a strange presence within the household or ritual space. The living could look toward the skull, and the skull, through its shell eyes, could seem to hold its position toward them. It is not necessary to say that the people believed the skull literally watched them. The stronger and more cautious point is that they created a form that made looking possible again. In a world without written portraits, without photographs, without carved names, the remade gaze may have been one way to keep a person, or a remembered dead presence, inside the shared visual life of the group. Near Jericho, where settlement was making memory heavier and more local, this would have mattered. The living no longer carried all memory along changing paths. Some memory stayed near houses, floors, burials, and objects. A skull with shell eyes could concentrate that memory into a face. It could ask the living to meet the dead not only through thought, but through sight. This is why the object remains so difficult to reduce to one explanation. It may have been about ancestors, but ancestors here would not be distant names. They could be presences made close through eyes, bone, and plaster. It may have been about household continuity, but continuity here would not be a legal document. It could be a face that seemed to remain in the room. It may have been about grief, but grief here would not be only private sadness. It could be shaped into something others could see. The shell eyes do not solve the mystery, they deepen it. They show that the ancient makers understood, at least in practice, that a human face without eyes is not fully a face. They knew enough through their own bodies and social lives to fill the emptiest part of the skull with the sign most closely tied to presence. What remained was not a person and not a simple object. It was a face that could not see, made for people who still needed to look. Not every skull was given a face again. That is one of the details that makes the practice more meaningful and more difficult. If every person who died in a community had been treated in the same way, the act might seem like a general rule of burial, a normal step in caring for the dead. But the evidence from plastered skulls suggests selection. Some skulls were removed, treated, modelled, and transformed, while many dead people were not preserved in that visible form. This does not mean we know exactly who was chosen. It does not mean the chosen individuals were all leaders, elders, parents, founders, or people of special rank. Those ideas may be considered carefully, but they cannot be stated as certainty. What matters first is the difference itself. A remade face was not simply what death did to everyone, it was something the living did to some of the dead. Selection changes the meaning of the object. It turns the plastered skull from a general response to mortality into a social decision. Someone had to decide, or a shared custom had to define, which skull would be taken, which face would be shaped, which absence would be made visible. In a small early settlement, this choice would not have been empty. People knew one another through repeated contact. Faces were not anonymous. A person's body was part of a web of work, kinship, memory, obligation, and daily recognition. In the long beginning of human life, group survival depended on these webs. No one lived as a separate island. Children survived because others fed and protected them. Adults survived because knowledge, labor, and warning were shared. Older people may have carried memory of seasons, places, plants, conflict, and past hardship. Even before settled life, each person occupied a position in the group that others had to understand. With settlement, those positions may have become tied more strongly to houses, floors, storage, food production, and claims of belonging. If only some skulls were given faces, then those people, or what they represented after death, may have mattered in a particular way to the living. The skull could have belonged to someone remembered directly. It could have represented a household line. It could have marked continuity with people buried beneath or near domestic spaces. It could have carried social meaning that went beyond personal affection. The problem is not that we lack possible explanations. The problem is that several explanations remain possible at once. A selected skull might point to love, status, ancestry, ritual duty, household identity, or the need to keep certain dead close while others remained hidden. The archaeological record does not allow us to choose one answer and close the question, but the selection itself still tells us something. It shows that the dead were not all treated as identical remains. Some human heads were brought back toward face, toward gaze, toward social presence. That means the living were making distinctions after death. In a world without written names or formal documents, such distinctions may have been carried through the body itself. A face could stand where a written record did not exist. A skull could become a sign that someone, or some connection, still mattered. This connects the object directly to the beginnings of settled human memory. When a community lives in one place, the number of remembered dead slowly grows. Not every memory can be held with equal force. Some people fade into general ancestry. Some remain attached to stories. Some become linked to houses or lines of descent. Some may be selected for special treatment because they help the living organize who they are. The plastered skull may belong to this kind of selective remembering. It is not just a trace of death, but a trace of difference among the dead. It asks why this person, or this head, was made visible while others were not. It asks what qualities the living saw, or needed, in that face. And because the answer is no longer recoverable with certainty, the object keeps its power. It shows us not only that ancient humans remembered, but that they chose where memory should become visible. In a small community, no one is only an individual body. Each person lives inside a net of remembered acts. Someone knows how to find water when the dry season presses harder. Someone remembers which plants are useful and which can make a child ill. Someone has carried infants, repaired walls, shaped tools, settled conflicts, shared food, or held knowledge from a time before younger people were born. In the early settled world near Jericho, these roles may have become more visible because people were no longer moving through the landscape in the same old way. They were gathering around houses, floors, storage, work areas, and a spring that helped life continue across years. In such a place, generations could overlap in a new physical way. Children might grow up among older adults who remembered earlier buildings. Adults might live beside the buried dead of people who had shaped the household before them. The living group was not only a present crowd of breathing bodies, it was a chain of dependence reaching backward. This matters for the plastered skull because selection is never just about the dead. It is also about what the living need to remember. If only some skulls were treated with plaster and shell eyes, then the practice may have marked differences that mattered inside the community. Those differences might have been age, kinship, status, household connection, remembered skill, descent, ritual role, or something else we cannot safely name. The exact reason is hidden from us, but the social shape of the act is still visible. A skull chosen for treatment was separated from ordinary disappearance. The head was taken from the wider category of human remains and given a face again. It became a point where the living could focus attention. In a world without written genealogy, without carved names, without documents of inheritance or family lines, such a face may have helped hold memory in a visible form. A group does not need writing to know that some people carry special weight. In many human societies, older generations become important because they link the present to what came before. This does not always mean power in a formal sense. It can mean knowledge, remembered suffering, long care, descent, or the feeling that certain people anchor the group's story. Near the beginnings of settled life, Such anchoring may have become especially important. When people stay in one place, the question of who belongs grows heavier. Belonging is no longer only a matter of moving with the group. It can become tied to a house, a burial, a floor, a field, a spring, a storage place, or a cluster of walls repaired across time. The dead can become part of that belonging. Their remains can say, silently, that the present generation did not simply arrive without roots. A skull with a remade face might have helped make those roots human-sized. It could turn descent or household continuity into something a person could look toward. This is why the object should not be reduced to private grief alone. Grief may have been involved. Love may have been involved. The loss of a recognizable face may have hurt then as it hurts now, because the human body has always known people through faces, but the social world around the skull may have been broader than sorrow. The face could have gathered several meanings at once. It could have held a remembered individual in a larger line of connection. It could have comforted some and reminded others of duty. It could have marked a household's depth in time. It could have made a dead presence available to more than one living memory. In a small population, where each generation knew the next, and where survival depended on cooperation, memory was not a luxury. It was part of how the group remained itself. The plastered skull may belong to that system of memory. It was not only a face brought back after death, it may have been a selected face, a chosen surface, where the community placed the weight of continuity. The living could not preserve every person in the same visible way. Time would take most names, most voices, most expressions. But in some cases they shaped bone into a face and allowed one trace of the dead to stand for more than a single loss. Selection, then, makes the skull more mysterious, not less. It asks what kind of person, what kind of relationship, or what kind of remembered place was important enough to receive a second face. Selection turns the plastered skull into something more than a trace of mourning. It suggests that the dead were not all remembered in the same visible way. Some remained in the earth, hidden beneath floors or near houses, while at least some heads were brought into another kind of attention. That difference makes the skull social before it is symbolic. It points toward a community making choices about memory, even if the rules behind those choices are no longer recoverable. We should not rush to fill the silence with modern assumptions. The selected person may have been old, but age alone cannot be proven. The person may have belonged to an important household, but we cannot name that household. The skull may have represented an ancestor, but we cannot know whether the living thought of ancestry as we do. It may have carried affection, obligation, status, fear, continuity, or several of these at once. What matters is that the face was not restored for everyone. A second face was given only where the living found, or inherited, a reason to give it. In a small early settlement, such a decision would have touched the whole fabric of life. The dead were not anonymous numbers in a faraway cemetery. They had once been part of the daily world, eating near others, sleeping near others, working near others, aging in view of others, perhaps teaching, caring, leading, depending, failing, and being remembered through repeated contact. Human beings evolved inside this kind of dense social knowledge. Long before Jericho, a group survived by knowing not only where food might be found, but who could be trusted, who needed help, who carried skill, who remembered old dangers, and who belonged. The face made those relationships visible while a person lived. After death, the chosen skull may have allowed some part of that social position to remain visible. This is why the object should not be reduced to a single private feeling, as if one person merely missed another and made a face from grief alone. Grief may have been present, but the skull likely belonged to a wider world of relationships. A face remade after death could hold the memory of an individual while also helping the group organize the meaning of that individual. It might have linked the living to a line of people who came before. It might have helped a household remember its depth in time. It might have marked a person whose role did not end neatly when the body stopped breathing. It might have made visible a connection between the dead, the house, and the ground itself. None of these possibilities can be turned into certainty, but all of them keep the object close to its real setting, an early settled community where people, houses, burials, and generations were becoming tightly bound together, Selection also reminds us that memory is never equal in any human group. Some faces remain longer than others. Some names, if names were used then in ways we cannot recover, may have been spoken more often. Some people become attached to places after death. Others fade into the shared background of the dead. This may sound harsh, but it is part of human memory from the beginning. The mind cannot hold every life with the same clarity forever. Communities choose, sometimes gently and sometimes through custom, which lives become anchors. Before writing, before carved genealogies, before formal monuments, such anchors could be material. A skull could become one. A plastered face could make one life, or one line of life, harder to lose. This does not mean the chosen skull belonged to someone powerful in a modern political sense. Power in an early village may not have looked like kingship, property, or command. It may have been woven through age, knowledge, descent, household role, ritual memory, or long care. A person could matter because they remembered, because they connected people, because they had built, birthed, taught, healed, stored, or endured. The archaeological record does not give us the story, but the remade face suggests that the living made distinctions among the dead. They did not only ask what a skull was, they asked, through action, what this skull meant to them. That is the deeper force of selection. It turns the question from why ancient humans remembered the dead into why they chose certain dead to be remembered in a face. The skull remains silent, but its silence is not empty. It holds the trace of a community deciding that one absence needed a visible form. For most of human history, people did not live as if the ground beneath them would remain theirs. The older rhythm of human life was movement. Camps could be made, used, remembered, and left. A group might return to a good place when the season changed, but the world did not hold them in one fixed circle of walls. Food shifted, water changed, animals moved, plants ripened and disappeared. Weather pushed bodies across valleys, hills, river edges, grasslands, and wooded places. The human body was shaped by that older rhythm. Feet carried memory through paths. Hands carried tools, infants, food, firewood, and the materials of temporary shelter. Knowledge lived inside living people more than inside built space. A child learned the world by following bodies that already knew where to go. The dead, in such a life, could be mourned deeply, but the living often had to keep moving. Memory travelled with the group, while bones might remain in a place that slowly became distant. This does not mean mobile people lacked attachment, ritual, or care for the dead. That would be far too simple, and it would be untrue. Humans have shown concern for the dead in many forms across a very long time, but settlement changed the physical weight of memory. When people began to stay longer in places like early Jericho, memory no longer moved only through voices and bodies. It began to gather in walls, floors, burials, storage places, paths within the settlement, and the repeated use of the same ground. A person could die, and the living did not necessarily move far away. The house could remain. The floor could remain. The spring could remain. The burial could remain close enough that the next generation grew above or near it. This is where the plastered skull becomes part of a larger transformation. It belongs to a world in which the past was becoming heavier because the living were becoming more rooted. A skull with a face is not only about one dead person, it is also about the change in human life that made a dead person's presence stay near the daily world. In the older mobile pattern, remembering may have depended more on speech, gesture, route, and repeated story. In a settled pattern, memory could be placed. It could be held by a house. It could be tied to the same ground where food was stored and children slept. It could become part of the physical environment, rather than only the inner life of those who remembered. This does not mean people suddenly became modern. The early Neolithic was not a clean break from the deep past. People still carried older bodies, older fears, older needs, and older habits. Hunger still mattered. Weather still mattered. Cooperation still mattered. But the direction of life was changing. A community staying near the same spring across generations had to live with the question of earlier people in a new way. Who had built here before? Who had died here? Who belonged to this house, this floor, this cluster of walls? Who gave the present group its place in time? Before writing, such questions could not be answered with documents. They could be answered through practice, burial, memory, and material signs. The plastered skull may have been one of those signs. It may have helped make the past visible in a community where the past was no longer left behind on the trail. The dead could become part of a house's depth. A face restored on a skull could give that depth a human surface. The object did not need to explain itself like a written text. It worked through nearness, recognition, and repetition. The living could look toward it and feel, perhaps, that the people of the present were not the beginning of the story. Others had lived close to the same ground. Others had carried the group before them. Others had vanished from breath and skin, yet had not entirely vanished from place. That is why settlement matters so deeply here. A skull was given a face again at a time when human beings were learning to stay long enough for the dead to become neighbors of the living. When people begin to stay, the past begins to pile up. It does not happen all at once. At first, a place is simply useful. There is water nearby. The ground can support plants. There is shelter from wind, or a route through the landscape, or stone, wood, reeds, clay, and other materials close enough to be gathered. A group returns because the place helps them live. Then return becomes habit. Habit becomes building. Building becomes repair. Repair becomes memory. A wall that has to be mended is no longer just earth and shape. It is something people expect to keep using. A floor that is resurfaced carries the pressure of many feet across time. A hearth used again and again gathers ash from more than one meal, more than one season, perhaps more than one generation. The human body begins to know the place in a way that is deeper than thought. It learns where the doorway is in low light. It learns the coolness of the floor before sleep. It learns where food is stored, where tools are placed, where others sit, where smoke gathers, where children curl close to warmth. In the old human beginning, before permanent settlement, memory was carried strongly through movement. Paths mattered. Camps mattered. Seasonal returns mattered. But the world did not force every memory into one house. At early Jericho, the settlement itself could begin to hold what bodies and voices once carried alone. This is a major change in the human story. It means that the past can become layered, one floor over another, one burial beneath another living surface, one repaired wall replacing an earlier wall, one generation moving through the traces of another. The dead, in such a world, do not simply belong to a single moment of grief. They may become part of the continuing structure of the place. A person dies, but the house remains. A body is buried, but the floor is walked over. A skull is treated, but the settlement continues to wake, work, eat, sleep, and remember around it. This layered life makes the plastered skull more understandable, though not fully explained. The skull with a face belongs to a world where time was becoming visible in matter. Houses were not eternal, but they lasted long enough to gather traces. Floors were not sacred by definition, but they could cover the dead. Objects were not written documents, but they could carry memory. In this setting, restoring a face to a skull may have been one way of allowing the past to remain near without becoming formless. Bone alone can endure, but bone alone does not easily carry the social warmth of a person. A face, even a made face, gives the living eye something to meet. It turns old presence into a visible point. The community may have needed such points because staying in place creates questions that movement can soften. When people move, the landscape itself can absorb loss. A grave becomes part of a route left behind. A dead person becomes a story carried forward. But when people stay, loss stays too. The dead are not far away. They are under, near, within, remembered beside the same walls. The place becomes heavier because it contains not only the living, but also those who have ceased to live there and yet have not entirely left. Near the sources of settled human life, this weight may have been new enough to require new forms of expression. The plastered skull may have answered that weight. It may have given the house or the group a way to hold a person in a form that could be seen again, not exactly as they were, not with the moving softness of skin and eyes, but with enough human shape to say that the past had a face. This is why the object is not only about death, it is also about time becoming domestic, time under the floor, time in the wall, time in the skull. time in the repeated return to the same place. Human beings had always remembered, but settlement allowed memory to gather around fixed points. A skull given a face again may be one of those points. It tells us that when ancient people learned to remain in one place, they also had to learn how to live with what remained there before them. A skull given a face again may be one of the quiet signs that humans were learning a new relationship with time. Not time as a number, not time as a calendar, not time measured by written records, but time felt through staying. When a group moves often, the past can remain alive, but it remains light enough to travel. It lives in remembered paths, seasonal knowledge, stories told beside fires, skills passed through hands, and the faces of older people who still carry what younger people do not yet know. When a group settles, the past begins to grow heavier. It gathers in places that do not move with the body. A wall remembers repair, a floor remembers weight, a burial remembers a person whose body no longer moves. A spring remembers return because people keep coming back to it. Near Jericho, this heaviness of place was becoming part of human life. The people were not modern farmers in the later sense, and they were not citizens of a city with writing and law. They were people living through one of the slowest and most important changes in the human story, the movement from a life shaped mainly by mobility to a life in which houses, stored food, domestic space, and local memory began to matter more. In that world, a plastered skull was not only a strange object, it may have been a way to give the past a face at the very moment when the past was becoming harder to leave behind. The title question returns here with more weight. Why would ancient humans give a 9,500-year-old skull a face again? One careful answer is that they may have needed a visible form for memory in a world where memory was becoming rooted. The dead could no longer be only carried forward in speech or feeling. They could remain close to the floors, houses, and ground where the living continued. A face made from plaster may have helped turn that nearness into something the human eye could meet. It did not have to be a perfect likeness. It did not have to be a portrait in the later artistic sense. It only needed to make the skull more human than bone alone. The face could hold together two different truths. The person was gone, and yet the relationship to that person, or to what that person represented, had not ended. This is not only an archaeological idea, it grows from something older in the human body. Our species began in small social worlds where survival depended on remembering others. A person was not simply a body that ate and slept. A person was a voice, a face, a pattern of behavior, a source of knowledge, a relation to children, adults, elders, and place. When that person died, the biological body changed, but the social person did not vanish from memory at the same speed. For people living near the beginnings of settlement, this delay between bodily death and social disappearance may have become attached to the house itself. The dead remained under the floor. The living remained above it. The skull, if selected and shaped, could stand somewhere between the two. It could bring the hidden past into visible form without fully bringing it back to life. That is why the object feels both intimate and historical. It does not show us a grand empire, a written myth, or a public monument. It shows us a small human attempt to hold on to recognition when the world itself was changing around the way people lived. The community was learning to stay. Staying made memory accumulate. Accumulated memory needed forms. Some forms were walls and floors. Some were burials. Some may have been faces remade from skulls. The plastered face therefore belongs not only to death, but to the beginning of place-based human history. It suggests that as people anchored themselves to the ground, they also anchored the dead more deeply into the living world. The skull did not answer every question. It did not tell us the name of the person, the ritual, the words spoken, or the exact meaning of the shell eyes, but it does show that the past, once it had a house to remain in, could become close enough to look at. The skull from Jericho should not be treated as a lone miracle, as if one ancient group once did something strange and then disappeared from the human story. It belongs to a broader pattern in the early Neolithic Levant, where a number of human skulls were separated, treated, and in some cases modelled with plaster. Jericho is famous because its plastered skulls are among the best-known examples, and because one of them has drawn modern attention so strongly. But the deeper meaning of the practice becomes clearer when we remember that similar acts appear across more than one place and more than one community. This does not mean every skull was made in the same way, or that every group held the same belief. It means that, during this early settled period, the human head became the focus of repeated attention. The act was not random. It was not simply a single unusual object made by one unusual person. It was part of a wider world in which people were experimenting with new ways to live with the dead, new ways to connect houses with memory, and perhaps new ways to make ancestry visible before writing existed. To understand this without exaggeration, we have to hold two ideas together. The first is caution. The archaeological record does not give us one unified religion stretching across all early Neolithic communities. We cannot say that every plastered skull meant ancestor worship in the same form, or that every house used skulls in the same way, or that every face represented the same social role. The second idea is pattern. When similar practices appear in related regions and time periods, they suggest that certain concerns were widely shared. People were repeatedly treating the head as a meaningful part of the body after death. They were sometimes removing it, preserving it, reshaping it, or placing it in contexts that gave it special weight. Near the beginnings of settled life, this is not a small detail. It suggests that the transition toward houses, storage, farming, and place-based community also brought new forms of remembering the dead. The human body at this moment still carried the inheritance of the old mobile world. It still needed to walk, work, gather, build, carry, and endure. But the social world was changing. Settlements made generations more visible to one another. A house could outlast one life. A buried body could remain near the living. A skull could be brought out of the hidden place of death and shaped into a presence. When this happens in more than one community, the question becomes larger than one person. It becomes a question about why early settled humans gave so much attention to the head. The answer may lie partly in biology, because the head held the face, the eyes, the voice, and the signs of recognition. It may lie partly in social life, because the head could stand for a person's continuing place within a household or lineage. It may lie partly in settlement itself, because living in one place made the dead harder to leave behind. These explanations do not cancel one another. They may have overlapped inside the practice. A skull could be a remnant of an individual and a sign of ancestry. It could be a focus of memory and a marker of belonging. It could be tied to grief, but also to continuity and social order. This is why the wider pattern matters. It prevents us from treating the plastered skull only as an isolated emotional response. It places the object within a long human adjustment to a new kind of life. As people learn to remain near the same spring, the same walls, and the same floors, they also learn to manage the growing weight of the past. The dead were no longer only behind them on the trail. They were beneath them, near them, and sometimes given a face again. Across early settlements, the treated skulls quietly suggest that ancient humans were trying to solve a problem that had become more visible with settlement. How can a community keep its dead close without confusing them with the living? And how can the past be given a form strong enough to remain in the shared world? The repeated attention given to skulls in the early Neolithic world suggests that these communities were not treating the human body as a simple thing after death. The body could be buried, but the head could be returned to, separated, shaped, or kept in a different way. This does not mean every group followed one rule. It does not mean every skull had a face of plaster or shell eyes. It means that, in several places across the Levant, the head became a special focus of human action. The pattern matters because repetition turns a single strange object into a wider human question. Why the head? Why the face? Why the eyes? Why this effort during a time when people were beginning to live more closely with houses, floors, stored food, and the dead beneath or near domestic space? The answer cannot be reduced to one cause, but the pattern allows us to see the pressure from several directions at once. The head was biologically important because it held the face, and the face was the main surface of recognition. The head was socially important because it could stand for a person after the soft body had disappeared. The head was materially useful because bone could endure long enough to be handled and modified. The head was symbolically powerful, though we must use that word carefully because it carried the place where sight, voice, breath, and identity had once gathered. In the deep background of human origins, the face had already been central for a very long time. Our ancestors survived in groups where watching one another was part of survival itself. A face could warn, calm, command attention, invite care, show anger, or reveal exhaustion. A child learned the world through faces. Adults recognized allies and strangers through faces. Elders carried memory in faces that younger people had known across years. Death removed this living surface, but the skull remained close to it. That may help explain why the head repeatedly became a focus after death. It was the part of the body that most powerfully suggested the lost person, while still being durable enough to be transformed. In an early settlement, this would have taken on new meaning. The living no longer moved away from every trace of the dead. Houses and burials could remain together. A skull could be taken from a burial context and treated as a visible object. The repeated handling of heads may therefore reflect a changing relationship between people, place, and memory. A skull was not simply evidence that someone had died. It could become a way for the living to keep certain relationships active, or at least materially present. This is why the practice should not be treated as decoration. Decoration is too light a word for something done to human remains. Nor should it be treated only as fear of death. Fear may have existed, but fear alone does not explain the care, modelling, and attention to features. The skulls suggest a more complex social world. Some heads may have been chosen because the person mattered in life. Some may have represented household continuity. Some may have been used in practices connected with remembrance, belonging, or claims to place. Some may have carried meanings that changed over time, as younger people inherited objects made by older hands. Repetition also suggests that people learn from one another. A practice does not spread or continue unless it can be recognized by a community. Someone saw a skull treated in a certain way. Someone understood that such treatment belonged to a known field of action. Someone knew how to prepare plaster, how to shape a face, how to place shells, how to handle the dead with enough care that the act could be repeated. The making of a plastered skull was therefore not only an individual gesture, it depended on shared knowledge. That shared knowledge links the skull to the wider Neolithic transformation. People were learning new techniques for houses, floors, storage, and settled life. At the same time, they were developing new ways to manage the social weight of the dead. The head became a place where these changes met. Biological recognition, material skill, household memory, and early settlement all gathered around one small silent object. The repeated treatment of skulls does not give us a single answer, but it shows that the question was not accidental. Across this early world, some ancient humans returned to the human head because it remained the strongest bridge between a body that had ended and a person who still mattered. The repeated focus on the human head during the early Neolithic raises a question, larger than any single skull. Why, at this particular turning point in human life, did the head and face become such powerful places for the living to work upon the dead? The answer may begin with the body, but it does not end there. The face is the surface through which a person becomes socially visible. The eyes show attention, the mouth gives voice. The cheeks, brow, and jaw carry emotion, age, fatigue, recognition, and the marks of an individual life. When a person dies, the body remains for a time, but the living face begins to disappear. The skull is what stays nearest to that lost surface. It is not the person, but it is the structure around which the person was known. For early settled communities, that remaining structure may have become especially important because the dead were no longer always left behind in distant landscapes. They could remain tied to houses, floors, burials, and remembered places. A skull, then, was not only a bone, it was a durable point where biology, identity, and settlement could meet. This helps explain why the practice of treating skulls appears so meaningful in the Neolithic Levant. It came at a time when human beings were learning new ways to stay. Staying changed the meaning of the dead. A mobile group can remember its dead while continuing along routes shaped by seasons and food. A settled group lives with the dead in another way. The dead can remain underfoot, near walls, beneath floors, or within the same domestic world where later generations wake and sleep. The past becomes local. It develops an address. It gathers around a spring, a room, a house, a cluster of houses, a path between walls. When memory becomes tied to place, the head may become the most human form that memory can take. A buried body may mark death, but a modelled skull can mark presence. The face made from plaster may have helped the living see continuity where the body itself had decayed. It may have allowed them to hold a connection between a person, a household, and the ground that the group continued to occupy. This does not require us to claim that all skulls meant the same thing. In fact, they almost certainly did not need to carry only one meaning. Human practices around the dead often hold many layers at once. A skull could be a remembered person and a sign of ancestry. It could be a private loss and a public marker. It could be connected to affection, obligation, fear, authority, protection, belonging, or a sense of continuity that later language cannot recover. The early Neolithic world did not leave written theology for us to read. It left worked bone, plaster, shells, houses, burials, and patterns of treatment. Those traces tell us that the head had become a place where something important could be done. The reason may be that the head carried the strongest visible link between the dead body and the living social person. In the deep human beginning, before settlement, before pottery, before written history, social life had always depended on recognizing others. A person's face was not decoration. It was a living map of relationship. Near Jericho and other settlements, that ancient human sensitivity met a new historical condition. People were beginning to live in places long enough for earlier generations to remain physically close. The old human need to recognize and remember did not disappear. It found new material forms. Plaster could become a second skin. Shells could become a sign of eyes. A skull could become the place where absence was shaped into a face. The larger pattern does not give us a final answer, but it narrows the mystery. Ancient humans may have given skulls faces again because the head remained the most powerful bridge between the living person and the dead body, and because settled life made that bridge more necessary. The dead were becoming part of place. The face made them visible within that place. In a world before writing, before portraits, before monuments as later civilizations built them, the human head offered a small, direct, and deeply familiar way to say that a life had ended, but its presence had not entirely left. When modern researchers look at the ancient skull from Jericho, they are doing something strangely close to what the Neolithic makers once did, though with very different tools and a very different purpose. The ancient hands shaped plaster over bone to bring a face back into the living world of their own community. Modern scientists use scanning, imaging, measurement, comparison, and careful reconstruction to understand the person behind the object, without pretending to know more than the evidence allows. In both cases, the skull becomes a starting point for the return of a face. Yet the modern return is not magic, and it is not a perfect window into the past. A reconstructed face based on a skull can suggest proportions, structure, age, sex-related skeletal traits, and the possible arrangement of soft tissues. It can help people see that the object was once a human being, not merely an archaeological specimen, but it is not a photograph. It cannot recover the exact expression, the exact softness of the skin, the colour and movement of the eyes, the small asymmetries that made the person familiar to those who knew them. It cannot recover the voice, the way the mouth moved in speech, the way the face changed in anger, tenderness, fatigue, or recognition. The skull gives structure, not life. Science can make a careful approximation, not a return. This distinction matters because the plastered skull itself sits at the boundary between evidence and imagination. The ancient makers also worked with structure. They had the skull, the enduring frame beneath the vanished face. They added plaster where flesh had gone. They placed shells where eyes once received light. They made a human surface from the remains of a human head. Modern reconstruction works in another direction, with cameras, digital models, and anatomical knowledge, but it faces the same deep limitation. A skull can guide the face, but it cannot fully give the person back. The distance between bone and person remains. Near the beginning of settled life, the makers of the plastered skull may have been answering that distance through ritual, memory, ancestry, or household continuity. Modern researchers answer it through analysis and public understanding. The goals are different, but the pull is similar. We do not like a human skull to remain only an object. We try to understand whose skull it was, how they lived, what world shaped them, and why others treated their remains with such care. This is a very old human impulse taking a modern scientific form. From our earliest social origins, human beings have not related to one another as bodies alone. We read faces. We remember faces. We attach identity to the front of the head because that is where we encountered the living person. So when a skull from nearly 9,500 years ago is scanned and studied today, the desire to see a face again is not only public curiosity, it is a continuation of the same human tendency that made the original object powerful. Still, modern seeing must remain humble. Technology can reveal hidden details, but it cannot read ancient minds directly. It can show how plaster was shaped, how the skull was modified, perhaps how the individual's head was formed, and how the object was made. It cannot tell us the exact words spoken over it, the exact relationship between the living and the dead, or the precise meaning of the shell eyes. The reconstructed face of the ancient person helps restore dignity and nearness, but it also reminds us of loss. We can come closer than a bare skull allows, but we cannot cross all the way back into the room where the face was first made. That is why the scientific image should be seen carefully. It is not the final answer to the ancient question. It is another layer in the long history of humans trying to meet the dead through the face. The Neolithic makers used plaster and shell. Modern researchers use scans and anatomical knowledge. Both acts begin with the same silent fact. Bone remains after the living face is gone, and human beings keep trying to bridge that distance. The ancient makers of the Jericho skull and modern researchers stand far apart in time, but both meet the same silence. A human face is gone, and the skull remains. Nearly 9,500 years ago, people answered that silence with plaster, shell, touch, and a form shaped by hand. Today, researchers answer it with scanning equipment, digital models, anatomical study, and careful comparison. These acts are not the same. One belonged to a living Neolithic community whose beliefs we can only approach through traces. The other belongs to modern science, where the aim is not to continue an ancient ritual, but to understand the object, protect it, and help the public see the human being behind the remains. Yet the resemblance is difficult to ignore. Both acts begin from a skull. Both try to move from bone toward face. Both recognize that the human head without a face feels incomplete to the living mind. The ancient plastered skull was made in a world without writing, without photography, without museum labels, without the modern idea of archaeology. The modern reconstruction is made in a world filled with images, measurements, and explanations. But underneath both is a human need to cross the distance between remains and person. That distance has always been painful and strange. In life, a person arrives through the face. After death, the face disappears faster than memory does. The living continue to remember features that the body no longer holds. The ancient makers may have worked inside that gap. Modern researchers work inside it too, though they speak in the language of evidence rather than belief. When scientists reconstruct a face from a skull, they do not bring the dead back. They make a guided possibility. They build outward from bone, using knowledge of facial anatomy, tissue depth, age, and skeletal form. They can suggest the shape of a nose, the width of a face, the position of eyes, the structure of cheeks and jaw, but every reconstruction carries limits. The living person's exact expression is lost. The surface of the skin is lost. The habitual softness or tension of the face is lost. The look a person gave to someone they trusted is lost. The way their face changed when tired, hungry, amused, afraid, or attentive is lost. That loss is important because it protects the truth. A reconstructed face is not a recovered soul, not a photograph, not the final return of identity. It is a careful bridge. The same can be said, in another way, of the Neolithic plastered face. It was not the living person either. It was a made bridge from the skull toward recognition. The makers covered bone with a surface, but the person's moving life was gone. They placed shells where eyes had been, but sight did not return. They created a face that could be encountered but not answered. In this sense, The ancient and modern attempts mirror one another across a vast distance. One is ritual or social practice, whose exact meaning remains uncertain. The other is scientific and educational, but both reveal how strongly human beings resist reducing a skull to an object. This resistance has roots in the long human beginning. Our species evolved in social worlds where recognition was not optional. Faces told us who belonged, who needed care, who might help, who might threaten, who carried memory, who had changed with age or illness. To see a face was to place a body back into relationship. This is why a museum reconstruction can feel moving even when we know it is approximate. It asks us to stop seeing the skull only as ancient material, and to remember that the bone once belonged to someone who breathed in a real landscape, drank from real water, lived among real people, and was known by a face before becoming archaeology. The Neolithic makers may have sought a different kind of nearness, but they too began with the fact that bone alone was not enough. Across thousands of years, the same quiet problem remains. When a face is gone, how much of a person can still be brought back into view? To look at a human skull in a museum is to stand before someone who has been changed twice. The first change came through death, when the living body lost warmth, expression, movement, and the soft surface by which others knew it. The second change came through preservation, excavation, study, and display, when the remains became part of a modern institution, placed behind glass, labelled, interpreted, and seen by people from a world the original person could never have imagined. This second change asks for care. A skull is not only evidence, it is not only material from the past. It was once part of a person who had a body, a childhood, hunger, sleep, pain, habits, and a face recognized by others. The Jericho skull carries that truth with unusual force because it had already been transformed by ancient hands before modern archaeology ever found it. The Neolithic makers did not leave it as bare bone. They covered it, shaped it, and gave it eyes made from shell. They treated the head as something more than remains. When modern people look at it now, we inherit not only the skull, but also the ancient act of care, selection, and meaning placed upon it. That makes the ethical question deeper. We are not simply looking at a dead person, we are looking at how other dead people, and other living people, treated the dead long before written history. There is a risk in making such an object too familiar. If we turn it only into a mystery, we may forget the person. If we turn it only into an art object, we may forget the body. If we turn it only into proof of a theory, we may forget the silence that still surrounds it. The skull does not exist only to satisfy modern curiosity. It asks for a slower kind of attention. The face made from plaster should remind us that ancient people were already responding to loss in a thoughtful way, even if we cannot translate their thoughts exactly. Modern study can honour that by being precise, cautious, and humble. It can ask what the object shows without pretending it shows everything. It can describe plaster, shell, bone, settlement, burial, and comparison with related finds, while leaving room for meanings that have not survived. This is part of the educational value of archaeology. It teaches us not only what happened, but how carefully we must think when evidence is partial. The person behind the skull lived in a world near the beginning of settled human life, but not outside humanity. They were not a symbol first. They were a human being before becoming an ancestor, a ritual object, a museum object, or a scientific subject. Their body belonged to a community that knew faces without photographs, remembered people without written names, and shaped memory through materials close to earth, fire, water, and hand. When we look at the skull today, the right response is not fear or spectacle, it is recognition with restraint. We can recognize that this head once belonged to life. We can recognize that ancient makers gave it a face again for reasons that mattered to them. We can recognize that modern researchers, by studying and sometimes reconstructing it, are also trying to restore a measure of personhood to remains that could otherwise seem distant and silent. But restraint means knowing where recognition stops. We cannot give the person a full biography. We cannot know their voice. We cannot know whether they were loved, feared, honored, chosen, or transformed after death for reasons no modern word can hold. The skull remains between knowledge and unknowing. That position is not a failure. It may be the most honest place to stand. In the deep human beginning, people learned to survive by reading one another, caring for one another, and remembering one another after absence. The plastered skull from Jericho reminds us that the dead have never been only biological endings. They become part of how the living understand themselves. To see such a skull well is to see both the ancient person and the distance that protects them from our easy answers. What remains after a life has ended is never only one thing. There is the body, which changes according to biology. There is the memory, which changes inside the living. There is the place, which may hold traces longer than a voice can. There are objects, walls, floors, burials, and small arrangements of matter that survive long after the reasons behind them have become quiet. The plastered skull from Jericho brings all of these together. It begins with the human face, the surface through which one person was known by others. It passes through death, where the soft signs of that face disappeared. It rests on the skull, the durable frame left behind. It carries plaster, a material made through human skill, pressed over bone to create a second surface. It carries shell eyes, placed where sight had vanished, turning hollow absence into the suggestion of a gaze. It belongs to an early settled world, where houses, floors, burials, memory and place were becoming more closely tied together than they had been for most of the older human story. None of these details gives the full answer alone. Together, they form a careful path toward the question. A 9,500-year-old skull was given a face again because, in some way, the dead person or the dead presence still mattered to the living world. That is as far as we can go with confidence. The rest must remain open, but not empty. The face may have carried personal memory. It may have carried ancestry. It may have helped a household remember its depth in time. It may have made visible a connection between the living, the dead, and the ground they occupied. It may have done several of these things at once. To say this carefully is not to weaken the story. It is to respect the age of the evidence. The people of Jericho did not leave written explanations. They left a transformed skull. They left an action that still holds human force because it touches something older than writing, the need to keep relationship from vanishing as quickly as the body. From the beginning, human life was never only individual life. A person survived through others. A child needed long care. Adults depended on shared knowledge. Older people carried memories of seasons, places, dangers, and skills. Faces became the visible signs of these relationships. The face told the group who was near, who was familiar, who needed help, who gave help, who had aged, who had suffered, who belonged. Death removed the living face, but it did not instantly remove the person from the minds of those who remained. That delay between biological ending and social disappearance is one of the deepest human facts. The plastered skull seems to stand inside that delay. It is not life, and it is not simple absence. It is a made form placed between the two. It tells us that the dead were not always allowed to dissolve into bone without response. In the early settled world, that response may have grown stronger because people were beginning to remain close to the same ground. Settlement changed the emotional weight of time. A house could outlast one body. A floor could cover older remains. A spring could draw generation after generation back to the same place. The past no longer stayed only in stories carried along the trail. It gathered underfoot. The plastered skull may have been one way of giving that gathered past a human surface. It did not need to explain itself like a written text. It worked through nearness, through recognition, through the strange power of a face that could no longer live, but could still be seen. The educational value of this object is not that it gives us a dramatic secret about ancient people. It teaches something quieter and more useful. It teaches that archaeology is strongest when it holds evidence and humility together. We can see the skull, the plaster, the shell eyes, the settlement, the repeated attention to heads in the Neolithic Levant. We can build careful interpretations from those traces, but we must not pretend to hear words that were never preserved. The ancient makers left us neither myth nor instruction. They left us a human act shaped in material, and that may be enough. It shows that very early in settled life, people were already using skill, care, and social memory to face a loss that every generation must meet. The body ends. The face fades. The living remain with a question. how much of a person can be held after the person is gone. The value of the plastered skull is not that it lets us solve ancient belief with complete certainty. Its value is that it teaches us how to think carefully when the evidence is old, human, and incomplete. A skull with a face invites strong feeling. It is easy to make it dramatic. It is easy to turn it into a secret, a ritual with a single hidden meaning, or a shocking sign of a strange ancient mind. But the object asks for something better than that. It asks for patience. It asks us to notice what is truly there. Bone, plaster, shell, shaped features, a place in the early Neolithic world, and the broader pattern of human heads receiving special treatment in some communities of the Levant. From those details we can build a careful understanding. We can say that the skull was not treated as ordinary refuse. We can say that effort was used to restore the suggestion of a face. We can say that the head mattered because it was the place of recognition, sight, voice, and social presence. We can say that settled life made the dead physically closer to the living in new ways. But beyond that, we must speak with care. We cannot say the exact words spoken by the people who made it. We cannot say exactly whether they felt love, duty, fear, reverence, grief, or something that no modern word can hold. This carefulness is not a weakness in the story. It is the story's honesty. Prehistory does not give us every answer, yet it gives us enough to see the deep outline of human concern. The people who made the plastered skull were not primitive shadows outside our understanding. They were human beings using the materials and knowledge of their world to respond to death, memory, and belonging. They lived without writing, without modern medicine, without photographs, without the protections and explanations later societies would build. Yet they knew faces, they knew loss. They knew the weight of people who had been present and then were gone. Their world was different from ours, but the distance should not make them unreal. Archaeology helps restore that dignity when it refuses both exaggeration and dismissal. It tells us that ancient people were not simple. Their actions could be practical, emotional, social, and symbolic at the same time. A skull given a face again may have been about one person, but it may also have been about a house, a lineage, a group, a place, or the continuity of the living with the dead. To hold all these possibilities together is more truthful than forcing one answer. It also gives the listener something useful beyond the ancient object itself. It reminds us that human beings have always needed ways to live with absence. Modern people use photographs, names, graves, stories, records, anniversaries, and quiet habits of remembrance. Earlier people used the materials available to them: bodies, bones, plaster, shells, houses, floors, and repeated acts whose meanings were understood within their own communities. The forms are different, but the underlying problem is deeply human. A person dies, yet the relationship does not vanish at the same moment. The body stops, but memory continues. The face fades, but recognition remains inside those who knew it. The living must decide, in every age, what to do with that difference. In Jericho, nearly 9,500 years ago, one answer may have been to shape a face where the face had disappeared. Not to deny death, but to make room for what death could not fully erase. That is the educational message of this ancient skull. It does not teach us that we know everything about the past. It teaches us to respect what can be known, to admit what cannot be known, and to see ancient human beings as people who carried questions much like ours, in bodies very much like ours. They too lived between survival and meaning. They too depended on one another. They too faced the quiet fact that those who shape us may leave before we understand what they gave. A skull with a face is therefore not only an archaeological mystery, it is a reminder that history begins wherever humans try to hold on to what time is already taking away. The plastered skull does not give us a final answer, and perhaps that is why it remains so human. It stands before us as a face made after a face had disappeared. It does not speak the language of certainty. It does not tell us whether the living touched it with grief, fear, reverence, duty, memory, or some feeling that belonged only to their world. It simply remains, carrying the trace of a decision made nearly 9,500 years ago. The skull would not be left as bone alone. The hollow places of the eyes would not remain hollow. the missing face would be shaped again. The dead would not return, but neither would they be allowed to vanish without form. This is where the ancient object becomes larger than its own small size. It reminds us that human beings have always lived between what nature takes away and what memory tries to hold. Biology removes the living face quickly. Time removes voices, gestures, names, and the private details that once made a person familiar. But the living do not always accept disappearance passively. They make graves, they keep objects, they repeat names, they tell stories, they return to places, they create images. In Jericho, long before writing, long before photographs, long before the monuments of later civilizations, some people shaped plaster over skulls and placed shells where eyes had once been. The act may have belonged to ancestor memory. It may have belonged to household continuity. It may have helped tie the dead to houses, floors, and a settled place. It may have made a remembered person visible to the living. It may have carried several meanings at once. We should let that uncertainty remain, because the uncertainty is part of the truth. The people who made it were not leaving a puzzle for us to solve completely. They were living inside their own world, with their own losses, obligations, and ways of understanding the dead. Yet even from a great distance, the object allows us to see a deep continuity in human life. Our ancestors did not become human only by making tools, building shelters, using fire, or learning to stay near water and cultivate food. They also became human by recognizing one another, depending on one another, and carrying one another in memory after absence. A face was never just a surface. It was where a person arrived in the minds of others. It was where the social body of the group became visible. When that face disappeared, something more than skin was lost. A relationship had lost its place to return to. The plastered skull seems to answer that loss without pretending to undo it. It accepts the skull, the bone, the fact of death. But it also gives the living eye something human to meet. That is the quiet power of the object. It is not dramatic in the loud sense. It is not a secret civilization or a shocking hidden truth. It is a small human effort placed against the oldest ending. A person dies. The face fades. The group remains. The place remains. The question of what to do with memory remains. In the early settled world, that question may have become newly urgent, because the dead stayed closer to the living than they often had in more mobile lives. Houses gathered time, floors covered earlier bodies. Children grew up above traces of people who had come before them. The past was no longer only carried forward in speech. It was also beneath the feet, inside the walls, near the hearth, held in the ground. A skull given a face again may have helped the living live with that nearness. It may have allowed the dead to become neither fully present nor fully absent, neither ordinary bone nor living person, but something in between, a memory with a surface. For us, looking back, the lesson is not to invent certainty where none survives. The lesson is to notice how old the human need for remembrance may be, and how carefully ancient people used the materials of their world to answer it. Bone, plaster, shell, house, floor, spring, and memory all meet in one silent head. The skull cannot tell us its name. It cannot tell us who shaped it, who looked at it, who felt comfort or unease before it. But it leaves a final question that still belongs to us. When humans gave the dead a face again, were they trying to remember a person, protect a place, hold an ancestor close, or keep something about themselves from disappearing too?